Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if female Deku had to marry at 17? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Plus Ultra. Those were the words Izuku would repeat to herself as she studied as hard as she could, every waking hour. This had to be her way out. Even if her father forbade it, she would be a hero somehow, some way. Her quirk, while not flashy, could be useful in some situations. Especially when it came to fighting fires. That was the goal. Get a full-ride scholarship, go to America, become a firefighter. She was a burden, and her stepmom and father kept reminding her of that. There was no way they'd help with any sort of schooling. But as much as they barely cared for her, they did care what other people thought. There was no warning for Izuku on how her whole life would change when she was called downstairs. It was a heart-stopping shock to see Endeavor sitting in her living room. Fire mustache and all. Izuku was still so enamored with heroes, like some sort of young fangirl. Maybe that's why she let out a sort of squeal when she saw him, and quickly grabbed one of her journals. Maybe it was that he was a hero why she didn't question why he was in their house. Racing back down the stairs, she expectantly held out a pen for him. Even if he wasn't one of her favorites, she still wanted his signature. He was still a hero. Oh my god, I can't believe it's you. I mean, it's obviously you. I mean, the fire, the height. You may be in civilian clothing, but the scar on your middle finger that you got from your fight with? Obviously annoyed, Endeavor turned toward her father. Is she always like this? Ashamed, Izuku's cheeks flushed red as she put the pen and journal behind her back, much like a child hiding a broken toy. With a wave, father replied. She can usually control it. He gave her a pointed look and Izuku shied away even further. Where were we? Endeavor moved on with whatever they had been talking about before Izuku had been called downstairs. So her quirk is resistance to all fire? He said as he sipped the tea Izuku's stepmom had just given him. Well, Izuku's quirk didn't technically work like that. It was more like a push of all external heat from her body, not under her natural body. An interesting combination of her mother's pole quirk and her father's fire. So yes, in a sense she was resistant to all fire. Test for yourself, father said as he got up from his chair, rolling up Izuku's sleeve. Izuku tensed, confused on what was happening, eyes jumping between the three other people in the room. Endeavor wrapped a hard hand around her wrist. The grip was painful. Suddenly, his fist was ablaze. Of course, Izuku felt none of it, even as the flames turned from orange to yellow to blue. Even her father and Endeavor were flinching back at the intensity. Seemingly satisfied, Endeavor let go of Izuku's wrist. Though there were no burns, it would surely be bruised by morning. What did I tell you? Father's smile widened like he was an auctioneer getting ready to close a bid. Total resistance? Endeavor smiled back, all teeth. They were to be married within the month. She wasn't pretty and her father could barely be considered new money, so she couldn't wrap her mind around why this hero wanted to marry her. But she could guess why her father had agreed. Was it the promise of money and prestige that came with a daughter married to the number 4 hero? Or maybe the freedom that no children brought that made her father agree to Endeavor's offer? Izuku would never know. It didn't matter that Izuku hadn't even finished school. It didn't matter that Izuku was just 17. All the anger and fear twisted itself into a strained smile on that fateful day. She had to smile, not because of her stepmother's insistence, but because that's what All Might would have done. Or, at least, that's what she hoped he would have done. Izuku thought that someone big like the number 4 hero would make this some sort of grand affair. Izuku was honestly glad it wasn't. The whole shrine had been shut down for this event, but there were barely more than 10 people there gathered. Gifts were exchanged, and since Endeavor seemed to have no living parents, it was mostly focused on her own parents. Did he have any other family? The media showed none, but Endeavor was a notoriously private person and they had never talked after the first day to even discuss things like that. It was strange that the only people who came for Endeavor were a couple of the heroes from his own agency. Of course, Izuku recognized them, but them there didn't excite her like normal. She was on the verge of vomiting anyway, Asking for an autograph or an in-depth analysis of their quirk would spell disaster. Hand in hand, Endeavor and her stood while the Shinto priest recited words that felt like they had no meaning. His grip was tight. She was glad she didn't have to kiss him then. Izuku was on the edge of crying every single second in pure terror and uncertainty. Her smile felt ragged and wobbly as the priest said his last words. The ceremony ended with little fanfare, and she and Endeavor were ushered into a nice car with its very own driver. The driver rolled up the divider. Izuku had given very little thought to what came after the ceremony. She realized this was the first person she had ever kissed. She didn't want to kiss him, but it didn't seem to matter that her lips weren't working like his or that her hands stayed glued to her sides as his roamed to places she had never let anyone near. He was too rough, and Izuku was too fearful to put up much of a fuss. Her scalp hurt. Bruised hips and shaking hands awoke with her the next day in a bed alone. A twin bed in a small room. Traditional walls and doors framed the mostly bare area. She was glad she didn't have to sleep in the same bed as him. Izuku's clothes hung in the closet all alone, put there by who knew, but it further marked that this would be her room only, free from Endeavor, her now husband, for the time being at least. Wincing with each sleeve, she finally got dressed after being left fully naked in their bedroom. The sudden urge to cry hit her. She didn't miss her old home, only her all-might memorabilia, maybe, but her dream now was even farther out of reach now. Practically impossible. Plus ultra. Izuku chanted to herself over and over between hard sobs, as if that would change something. Everything hurt. Her body, her heart, her mind. There was nothing else she could say or do, no plan came to mind to get her out. She was utterly alone, and that scared her more than it normally did. There was nowhere to run, so instead, she tried her best to stop the tears and open the door. She wiped the evidence with her sleeve and realized it no longer smelled like the detergent she used to use. Izuku tried not to cry anymore at that thought. The night before had been a blur. Izuku wanted to keep it that way, no matter how weak that made her. Taking a deep breath, she tiptoed down the stairs. The last thing she was expecting to see was a child. He was at least 12, with white hair dipped in red. They stared at each other in matching confusion and shock, surreal in its quiet moment. Izuku wasn't told that Endeavor has children. Did he even tell this kid that he was getting married? Quick as he had appeared, he ran down the hall. Stepping down the stairs to see where he went, Izuku was met with the sight of Endeavor blocking the doorway where the boy had been trying to flee to. "Tia," Endeavor said in a low voice. The child visibly stiffened as he faced his father. Though Izuku couldn't see his face, it was clear that he was afraid. Finally noticing her as well, Endeavor motioned to her to come forward. She moved as cautiously as she could, feeling the very tension in the air as if she could step on it and everything would break. "This is Izuku. She is my new wife." Tia turned around, and there was a contempt in his blue eyes that matched his father's. Izuku gave him her best smile, but it was etched with nervousness. The kid said nothing, but Endeavor snarled out, "This woman will be taking care of you and your siblings. Say something." Sour-faced, probably only because he was not facing his father, Tia replied in the angriest neutral tone Izuku had ever heard. "It's nice to meet you." Izuku wanted to shy away, but she held her ground as she looked down at him. "It's nice to meet you too." Endeavor, oblivious or just not caring, continued on as if this exchange wasn't as hostile as a war zone. "Get your siblings and Shudo, they will meet her as well." Scowling at Shudo's name, Tia did as he was told, fists clenched hard at his sides as he disappeared behind a sliding door. "Endeavor," she tried, with a noticeably higher voice. "I said last night that you will call me Mr. Todoroki," he interjected coldly. Izuku took a step back. She didn't remember that, and she'd wanted to keep it that way. Hero names aside, it seemed unfair that he called her by her first name when he only wanted her to call him by his last name, a power indifference that Izuku had no say in. "You, Mr. Todoroki, will I be able to continue school? I mean, I can do it online or maybe?" "No." A pit formed in her stomach that squeezed her heart. She wanted to push, to have the kind of courage that could change anyone's mind, but she didn't, quietly looking away from him as she tried to keep the tears at bay once again. Her dream felt a little farther away. But Endeavor towered over her. When I say no, it means no. What I say is final. You don't get to discuss it. Before anything else could be said, 3 children varying in ages entered the kitchen. A boy came in with a girl that held the hand of the youngest boy, who had a bandage over his left eye. All of them in some way or another reminded Izuku of candy canes. Tuya followed behind, still fuming. Endeavor held his head up as if he was a commander of a ship while looking down on all of them. Izuku here is my new wife, and will give me an heir that will be actually resistant to fire and heat. Endeavor shot a look at Tuya and a quick glance at the youngest boy with the bandage over his eye. Something in Izuku dropped at those words. Like a sort of nightmare where you fell and hit the ground, but couldn't wake up. Everything faded into the background as the reason for her marriage to Endeavor now became apparent. Izuku felt so stupid not to see it. The noise came back into her mind as she desperately tried not to vomit. She will take care of you, now that your mother has been removed. Seeing that there was nothing else to say, Endeavor left with no goodbyes. The tall boy looked like she was holding in his tears, but the littlest one wasn't as controlled at the mention of his mother. They all looked expectantly at her to say something. Lost, Izuku searched their faces for something she had missed. The girl mouthed, "Tell us about yourself." Izuku gave a small smile at this little kindness. My name is Izuku Todoroki. You can just call me Izuku. I'm 17 and She stopped herself. This wasn't school, where you listed off your quirk and your plans for the future. Not that her dream was any more achievable now or that she was going back to school. Instead, she deflected, "What are your names?" They listed them off accordingly, one by one. The girl was Fuyumi, the tall boy was Natsuo, and the littlest Todoroki was Shudo. "Do you have any questions for me?" What else was she supposed to say? "Hi, I don't want to be here, but your father is the number 4 hero and I just want to go to school. Where's the door?" The little boy raised his hand and Izuku, after a few moments of momentary confusion, called on him. "Why is your name a boy's name if you are a girl?" Tuya rolled his eyes at Shudo's question. Fuyumi slightly scolded him. Izuku didn't really want to explain that her father had wanted a son. And he had promised that her mother would be able to name the next child that had never come, so she just shrugged. Unsatisfied with the answer, Shudo pouted. Tuya crossed his arms. "Welcome to hell," he said, and promptly left without saying goodbye. Endeavor came back into the room as soon as Tuya left, now with a very long list in hand. The kids left scattered as quietly as possible to get away from his heavy footsteps. And when Natsuo and Shudo left, angry frowns laid starkly on their faces, too hateful, too deep for such small children to wear. The list marked all of her responsibilities, like housework and whatnot. There were details like what day the maids would come in and what to cook, etc. It was almost the same as when she lived with her father, which weirdly gave her a sense of comforting familiarity. Because this was something she could do and not F up, she also didn't have to be around Endeavor when she was doing these things. What was different, though, was that there were young kids in this equation. Kids that needed to eat, get to school on time, do their homework, get clean. All things that now seemed to fall to her, no matter how wholly unprepared she was or even that she was good with people, let alone children. These will be done on time. Endeavor said. Izuku nodded, a little too fast. Yes, of course. With as much courage as she could muster up, Izuku took a deep breath in and asked, I was wondering what happened to your ex-wife. I mean, like you said, she was removed, but I wanted to know in more exact terms what happened. She went crazy. And she burnt Shudo, with nothing but some hot water. 12 years down the drain waiting to give me something worth it. I thought I had 4 years ago when Shudo was born, but she proved me wrong. I guess in a way it was a good thing. It showed how weak he really is. His tone wasn't sad, more dripping with disappointment and annoyance. He's not weak. He's a little kid. Izuku defended, her tongue moving on its own, her eyes meeting Endeavor's defiantly. Where she got this bravery from she didn't know. He immediately grabbed her face with one hand. Her cheeks were held hard as he made her look up at him. "Don't get lippy," he simply stated, but his eyes were ablaze. Izuku's heart hammered in her chest as he stared her down, and it was hard to breathe from the intense rush of fear coursing through her. All she could do was try to nod, but even that was hard with how tight he held her in his grip. A couple of moments of silence passed and Izuku was on the edge of tears. But finally he let go and Izuku backed away, list still in hand, cheeks throbbing. I usually don't eat at home, but don't think you can make any sort of food that doesn't adhere to the diet I outlined on page 6. Shudo might be weak, but he is my backup, and he needs to be in proper shape to be a hero. Izuku stayed silent as he went on and tried to follow, but her heart was in her throat and it beat so loudly she could barely hear him. A buzz broke him from his monologuing, and he reached into his pocket to pull out his phone. There was a quick TSK and he was out the door. It was like Izuku could finally breathe again as the front door shut, and she leaned against the large kitchen counter for support as deep breaths flowed in and out. A couple of tears still managed to fall, but she wiped them before they got too far down her face. It was barely noon on her first day here. How could she live like this? She couldn't answer that question, but she could make lunch. She could give her hands something to do in lieu of thinking of what had happened or what will. Steadily, Izuku stood on her own and made her way to the refrigerator. She bent down to see what was on the bottom shelf. There was something prodding her in her pocket, hard and plastic. Wiggling it out, it took her a moment to really process what she was holding. Small and yellow, an All Might figurine laid, grinning up at her in her palm, though the paint was faded from going through the wash. Izuku's fingers traced the curves of the face, and the little details in the hair and the smile. He stood in his signature pose as if saying, I am here or plus ultra. It was like something broke and a deep sob escaped her. She clutched the All Might figurine close to her chest to will herself to stop, praying All Might would give her the strength she needed to survive. Izuku pressed him even closer. Would he break? She whispered to the figurine or maybe to herself, what have I gotten into? She didn't know how long she had cried as she knelt on the wood floor, but she finally calmed down enough to breathe out normally again. Hesitantly, she put the toy back in her pocket, the subtle indent in her thigh a reminder that she could stand, and so she did so, however shakily. Making lunch was a quick affair, even with the 4 extra mouths. When all was said and done, Izuku saw Fuyumi stick her head through the door frame. Would you get your brothers? I made lunch. Izuku tried to give her a smile, placidly, hoping there were no questions. She probably looked like a mess with her puffy red eyes still fresh from crying. Fuyumi nodded hesitantly as she ducked back into the long hallway. A few minutes later, all 4 kids were quietly eating, a tense air surrounding each bite. And when she made dinner, it was the same quiet that was choked with angry side eyes or curious glances, still forming options or judging her with already hardened ones. Endeavor didn't come home that night. And yet, Izuku couldn't sleep more than 3 hours. She was up by dawn and granted, it was a Sunday, but she felt the need to put on her uniform and pack her lunch. Izuku pushed the feeling of longing away as she shut her closet. No need to make herself a sobbing mess this early in the morning. With practiced, soft steps, Izuku went down the stairs into the kitchen. Again, the need to do something in her control overtook her in the manner of cooking. Breakfast was made and the lunch was prepped, and it was still 2 p.m. early with too many hours left in the day. Her hands still needed something to do. There were little things that could be done yet still. Standing in front of the kitchen window, Izuku watched her transparent reflection gently move her fingers through her hair, twisting and turning the strands into a loose braid. Normally, she would just keep it down or put in a bun, but the jitteriness in her finger made it hard to stand still and do nothing. In the corner of Izuku's eyes, she noticed Fuyumi watching her, following the way Izuku's fingers brought the ponytail around the end of the braid. I can braid your hair too if you want. That's what little girls like, right? How old was she, anyway? Izuku honestly had no idea. When she was about Fuyumi's age, most of the other girls would braid each other's hair. Izuku had tried to join once, but they said her hair was too thick and Izuku didn't ask again. Fuyumi looked up at her in surprise, like no one had ever asked her that before. If you don't want me to, it's totally fine. Could Izuku just say one right thing? Apparently not. I would like that, Fuyumi said to the floor as she folded her hands neatly in front of her. A lot actually. Izuku smiled in surprise. Take a seat then. Fuyumi sat at the dining table and Izuku stood behind her. She still had an extra ponytail in her pocket, since she usually had to use a couple to keep her own hair up. As Izuku used her fingers to gently brush Fuyumi's hair, she asked, "So how old are all you guys?" Fuyumi said she was 11, Tuya was 12, Natsuo was 7 and Shudo was 4. "And I'm in 6th grade, she added with a hint of pride. "I'm supposed to get you all to school tomorrow. Who else goes to elementary school?" No matter how detailed Endeavor's list was, it didn't even mention where any of the schools were or other important details. The house layout got more attention than these kids did. Shudo maybe got a little more, but even then it was as if he was a second thought. Natsuo goes to elementary school, Tuya goes to middle school, and Shudo goes to kindergarten. There was an awkward silence while Izuku parted her hair into 3 strands. Izuku then prodded about her classes, which Fuyumi was shyly excited to talk about, like how she was in advanced math and reading, and how she wanted to be a teacher one day. Eventually, she started moving her hands in excited waves as she spoke. "And I get to be in the geography bee this year in front of the whole school." Now deliberately going slower so Fuyumi could talk longer, Izuku brought the last strands together. Izuku tied the end of the braid. "That's a big achievement." "It's not that big of a deal. Natsuo is gonna be in it too for his grade," she said, fiddling with her hands in her lap. "Well, you both seem like very smart kids." There was a long pause and Izuku thought she must have said something wrong. But before she could start to backpedal everything, Fuyumi replied in a small voice. "Thank you." Izuku didn't know if she was thanking her for the hair or the compliment, but she smiled back anyway. "You're welcome." She stood back to observe her handiwork. It wasn't half bad, even with Fuyumi's natural flyaway hair and no bobby pins. "But all done. How's it look?" Fuyumi got up and walked to the window. The girl was silent as she moved her head from side to side to see it from different angles, studying it intensely. "I can take it out if you don't like it," Izuku said as she rubbed her neck. Immediately, Fuyumi responded with a shy smile, eyes still glued to her hair in the reflection. "No, I love it." However, as if catching herself in an emotion, Fuyumi quickly bowed lower than necessary. Thank you." As quickly as she had appeared, she left. Izuku was confused, but she considered it to progress. Maybe. Probably. Whatever progress meant anyway. Before she turned around, she spotted Shuto in the door, ducking away as soon as their eyes met. Throughout the day, Izuku could spot Shuto watching her, though she could never tell what he was feeling, strange for a kid that young. He would scamper out of sight right away when caught, or to a different hiding place, though he wasn't very good at hiding, so Izuku could always tell where he was. After dinner, Izuku finally caught him in the act. His stark hair was easily spotted as he sat behind a couch. Curious about what he was doing, Izuku went over and looked. He was thoroughly trying to unwrap the bandages on his eye, but he had tangled them up into knots. "Are you all right?" The kid must have jumped a foot off the ground. I'm okay," he mumbled out. "I can help you with your bandages if you want," she offered. He tilted his head. Why? It didn't feel like the kind of why a child would ask about the world and its workings. It lacked that intense curiosity. Izuku took a moment to find the right words. "Because you need help?" Shudo mulled over her what she just said as he gave a couple of extra tugs on the bandages that only made them tighter. "Okay." Smiling without teeth, Izuku went to the bathroom where she rummaged for a bit to find the first aid kit, where there was practically a whole hospital inside. When she came back, he was still sitting on the wood floor, tugging at the bandages. He was on the edge of tears and frustration, or maybe pain, but Izuku didn't know. Kneeling down to his level, Izuku said, "Let's go to your room and get some new bandages on." The kid would probably be more comfortable if he was in his own room instead of the hard floor here. The boy didn't say anything and stayed firmly on the ground. Izuku held out her hand. After moments of consideration, Shudo grasped it in his. "So," Izuku tried, "who usually does your bandages?" Hesitant to speak, Shudo turned his mouth into a frown. "Fuyumi, but she's busy now. I can do it myself. I'm a big kid. Sometimes even big kids need help." Shudo didn't say anything else. She sat on Shudo's bed with her phone balanced on one knee and the kid next to her. The phone had been a gift from her wedding, and she was still getting used to this different model, so it took a couple of tries before finally getting where she wanted to go. In the search bar, she typed, "How to dress a half-heeled burn wound." Clicking on the first YouTube option, an ad played for some new All Might toy. She was about to skip it, but Shudo squealed as All Might voiced over the ad. Izuku tilted her head. "You like All Might?" she asked. Endeavor was known for his deep hatred for All Might. She had even written an analysis on it in her younger days somewhere in her journals that were thrown away by her father. It was genuinely strange that his child would be so excited about him. Shudo nodded his head, then looked around his empty room before leaning in close as if to tell a secret. "He's my favorite," he whispered. That made Izuku smile warmly down at the child in her lap. "He's my favorite too," she whispered back with her own sort of secret. "I have an All Might figurine if you want to play with it." Eyes wide with admiration, the ad was ignored as Shudo went in for a tight hug. Izuku was caught a little off guard, but after a few moments of confusion, she hugged him right back, careful not to squeeze too tight. With one hand she fished the little figurine out of her pocket. "Thank you, Izuku," he said deep into her shirt as held the All Might figure close to his chest with one hand and the other holding onto her for dear life. "I promise not to tell father." "You're welcome. Doesn't that hurt your wound?" "Pressing your face, I mean." Shudo shook his head as he clung on tighter. "It only hurts a little. It's mostly itchy. I keep scratching at it and it goes open again." "Good to know." Izuku added that info into her mind as she continued to watch the video and Shudo clung tight. There was a sort of desperation in the way his hands wrung in her shirt, the way he still had his face half buried in her side. It was then that it hit her that he had no real adult to lean on. No mother, no father. Not that Izuku was much of an adult, but here she was, with a hand on his back and a need to make sure he was all right. He was so willing to open up to her, a practical stranger, because it was something he hopelessly wanted. Needed. She was his stepmom now, whatever that entailed, and that thought terrified her. How was she supposed to take care of these kids when she could barely keep herself together? Because clearly their father wasn't taking care of them, and now, without their mother, it seemed to all land to her. Izuku was cut from her thoughts as Shudo looked up at her with his one good eye. "Can we watch All Might after 2? There was nothing keeping her from smiling sweetly at this request. "Sure, but you have school tomorrow, so only one video? Kids needed to have a scheduled bedtime, right?" At least that's what her own mother had done, but she had no other reference. The boy nodded and went back to half hiding his face in her side and paying mild attention to the way the man in the video finished bandaging the wound. He was much more interested in moving the ball joints in the arms and legs of the figurine, figuring out how it worked and how far he could bend it. As soon as the video was over, Shudo shot up and started to run around his room, toy in hand as he made sound effects and dodged invisible villains. "You gotta settle down a little so I can wrap your face back up." She tried to be a little stern, but she was mostly just happy watching him play, and her tone was more light than she intended. Shudo slowed down a little bit as he took one last lap around the room before coming back to the bed where Izuku had spread out the supplies on the comforter. He was rocking back and forth while sitting on the bed, making the figurine fly through the air. She knelt in front of him and slowly followed the instructions she had just watched. Shudo was a pretty good patient for a 4-year-old, only fidgeting somewhat with the All Might toy in his hands. He was silent as he watched her hands move the hair out of the way as she took off his old bandages. One last round around his head, and Izuku safely secured it. All done. As if like SW, Shudo sprang up from the bed and started to race around the room with a new vigor. Louder now even in his happiness as giggles followed his footsteps. "You want to watch an All Might video now?" It was hard to keep the smile from her own face. His feet stopped dead in their tracks, and he stared at her as if he had forgotten in his dash to play that they got to watch an All Might video too. Shudo's face lit up in a way she had never seen before, and he crashed into Izuku with all the force his excitement could muster, which was surprisingly a lot. He climbed onto her lap without a second thought and could barely sit still as she pulled up her own favorite video, the one her mother had shown her all those years ago. As soon as All Might's voice rang out, Shudo squealed. Izuku could only see half his face, but there was a grin all the way to his ear. A chorus of O's and AWS filled the room as All Might saved person after person. Izuku had the urge to pat his head, but she resisted and dropped her hand back onto the bed. The video ended with little fanfare except for an ad for All Might cereal. Can we watch it again? He looked up at her with his big doe eye, both of his hands holding onto the All Might toy as if it would disappear. She kinda wanted to pinch his cheeks like an old grandma. Just one more time, and Izuku pressed play. Again, Endeavor didn't come home that night, and Izuku barely got any sleep. She beat the sun, an achievement for most people, but it was a daily routine for Isuku. Tiptoes and looks over Izuku's shoulders signaled the coast to be clear, just in case he did come home. She checked the door too, but the shoes he had worn out were nowhere to be seen. Internally sighing in relief, Izuku started breakfast with shaky hands and a wandering mind. After that was finished, she looked at her handiwork with a burning realization she had only made enough for herself, her father, and her stepmother. Muscle memory from all those years of doing everything in their house. She didn't want to think about them. The 2 extra servings were easy enough to make, and she placed them on the new plates set out. And like she had after making breakfast at her father's house, she went to work on lunch. Now there were school lunches to make and none of them were for her. The hurt stealed in as she closed the lids on the Tupperware of the finished product. A stuttering breath in, and a soft exhale. Before she could really break down, a flash of white caught her eye that quickly ducked behind the door frame. Fuyumi? The girl stuck her head out and adjusted her glasses. In no more than a whisper, she replied, "Good morning." Her hair was still in the braid from yesterday, though now it was fraying and strands stuck out at every angle. "Good morning. You're up early. So are you." Fuyumi sat at the dinner table where Izuku had already set down a serving in each spot. The girl was watching her curiously out of the corner of her eye as she began to eat. There was a silence that Izuku couldn't tell if tense or not. Maybe it was right in the middle. "I can, or rebraid your hair if you'd like for school." Izuku tentatively put it out there. Fuyumi froze midway through a bite, again looking surprised that anyone would ask her a question like that. Another stretch of silence followed. "Sure, if that'd be okay." Fuyumi replied. "You have very nice hair to braid with," Izuku commented in response. Gently, she undid her previous work, letting the white with red flecked hair fall back down. By the time Izuku tied off the new braid, Shudo had come and sat down, already digging into his food with gusto. "Are you ready for your first day of school, Shudo?" Fuyumi asked as Izuku went to get Shudo some chopsticks so he would stop eating with his hands. It was his first day of school, this far into the semester? The kid shrugged, but there was a hint of a smile on his face as he chewed. A new voice replied. "Welcome to the rejects, Shudo." Natsuo came in with his bag slung over his shoulder and his tie askew. "Bet you'll miss those fancy tutors within a week." Fuyumi shot Natsuo a look. "Be nice." Natsuo just rolled his eyes and breakfast was eaten in relative silence. With the dishes in the sink after everyone had eaten, except Tuya, they were ready to go. And before Izuku could even begin to ask where he was, Tuya emerged with a scowl on his face, just as angry as the first day she met him. "What are you doing?" There was nothing kind in his tone as he stared Izuku down. "Taking you guys to school. I know it's only a couple of blocks away and all the school buildings are together, but I don't need you to take me or any of us to school. Stop listening to whatever Endeavor says." Tuya yelled and stomped out the door. Natsuo followed him without looking back. Izuku gripped her jacket. "I guess I'm only taking you two to school then. Don't mind him, he just gets like that." Fuyumi tried to reassure her, but Izuku wasn't reassured. Shaking her head from her thoughts, Izuku opened the door and the 2 other kids followed. Izuku picked them up from school, much to Tuya's dismay. As they walked home, Tuya stayed a good 50 meters from them with Natsuo at his heels. Izuku could practically taste the contempt all the way away. "And the teacher read us a book." Shudo went on after Izuku asked about his first day of school. Izuku was about to ask which book when she noticed Tuya stop in front of the house, facing away from her. As Izuku, Shudo, and Fuyumi got closer, Tuya whipped around, baring his teeth. "Don't think you can just come in here and replace our mom. You can SCK up to Endeavor all you want, but," Fuyumi tried to put a hand on his shoulder to try and calm him down, but she was easily shrugged off. I don't want to replace your mom, Izuku said, voice taut with emotion. And I'm not on Endeavor's side. Then why the F are you here? I didn't have a choice, Tuya. He stiffened, recognition flashing in his angry blue eyes, but the fury was stronger than the empathy. They stood like that for a while before he stormed inside, and slamming doors followed. Natsuo went after him and gave Izuku a pitying look before disappearing inside as well. You didn't want to marry him? Fuyumi asked. Izuku couldn't meet her eyes, but she could feel them eyes watching her intently. As if it was a terrible secret, Izuku whispered, no. I just want to go to school, and she wanted to be some sort of hero, but saying that out loud didn't seem right anymore. Shudo, with his hands still tight around Fuyumi's school skirt, butted in. Only kids go to school though. Yeah, I guess so. Izuku ignored their looks and shook her head as if that would take away the pressure that was building up behind her eyes. Anyway, let's go inside. I've started dinner. Fuyumi, a definite people-pleaser, offered, do you need any help? I want to help too. Shudo added, raising his hand to be included. If you'd like to, I'd love both of your guys' help. Izuku smiled and hoped there were no tears on her face. The days would go smoothly for the most part if Endeavor wasn't in the house. Izuku would make breakfast and pack lunches, braid Fuyumi's hair, make sure Shudo ate with his chopsticks and not his hands, and struggle to tie Natsuo's tie. Tuya would come down as late as possible and refuse to even wear a tie, not that Izuku blamed him, but she hoped at least that wouldn't lead him to get into trouble. Then, when she'd come back from walking them to school by herself, she cleaned. Just the main house, though, apparently she wasn't allowed into the training hall. One day out of curiosity she had tried to open its big, thick steel doors while she was doing work in the courtyard and found it locked. Her days were strangely routine, with Endeavor mostly absent from most of them, still chasing that higher rank and greater glory. Still though, Izuku was haunted by his presence when he would filter in through the door with smoky breath, rough hands and barking orders. Though Endeavor hadn't been home for a whole week following a large earthquake and subsequent villain attacks. Maybe Izuku was getting used to his absence, and maybe so was everyone else. Izuku walked into the kitchen to start dinner when she spotted Natsuo in the kitchen. He was rummaging through the cabinets, oblivious to the world and focused on whatever he was doing. Whatcha doing there, bud? She asked as she rounded the corner. Sure, Natsuo wasn't openly hateful towards her, but she wouldn't call him friendly by any means. She hoped that he wouldn't bite something back. Not deviating from his mission, Natsuo didn't even look up. I gotta do something for, a pause? School. It's really important. But not important enough for you to know about. Oh really? Izuku smirked as she got out the pans needed to begin the katsudon. But she didn't press anymore, letting him have whatever he was doing. The object of his search seemed to be found as he held it. A normal glass bowl, high into the air like a trophy or loot from a video game. And with a triumphant smile to match his voice, he declared, yes. This will be perfect. Tuya is gonna be so jealous. And the bowl shattered into 1,000 pieces on the floor. Natsuo stood, horror-struck, in the shards at his feet. The front door had slammed open, and Endeavor's footsteps were getting closer. Izuku's heart was in her throat. She grabbed onto Natsuo, who didn't protest, too frozen in his fear to care, and she shoved him into the nearest pantry. His eyes were glassy as she shut the door behind him as quickly as she could. Right as she turned back around, Endeavor entered the room. His hair was in disarray and his scowl was deeper than normal. When he finally saw the mess on the floor, he bared his teeth. Izuku, who are you leaving this mess for? He accused with a sharp voice. No one. I just broke it so I'm looking for a broom. There's none in this pantry. She gestured wildly to the door. I made the mess so I need to clean it up. Let me get a different broom in a different closet. Endeavor crossed his arms. Use your hands. But her feet stopped dead in their tracks. Don't talk back, girl. Get it through your thick skull. You left this mess for me to step on, so get on your hands and knees and deal with the consequences. Fresh tears burst from Izuku's eyes without her permission. She held her tongue back. Slowly, she made her way to the scattered bowl and squatted down. The little micro shards dug into her feet, but she didn't make a sound. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. I said on your knees, he snapped. Are you stupid? Izuku bit her lip and tried holding back a sob. Slowly, she sunk down onto her knees, every shard digging its way into her flesh. She could taste blood in her mouth as she bit down as hard as she could to stay quiet. His eyes bore into her head as she ducked down and started to pick up the pieces into her hands. Her hands betrayed her as they shakily picked a piece up, and it cut her hand. It was a small cut, but the blood flowed easily onto the floor and clouded the rest of the glass in her palm and the droplets on the floor. Clean up the blood, was all he said, seemingly satisfied with the floor cleared of visible debris. Sidestepping her, Endeavor headed toward the pantry where she had stashed Natsuo. Her breathing began to pick up with every step he took. Izuku ran through the possible things she could say to pacify him. The kids were playing hide and seek, or he was looking for the broom as well. Endeavor stopped in front of the refrigerator, opening it and peering inside. Where did you put dinner? Izuku wasn't proud of the way her voice quivered. It's on the top shelf. He grunted in acknowledgement and grabbed the food. With quick use of his quirk, the food started to steam in the Tupperware. When you're done, come upstairs, he said as he started to exit the kitchen. Something in her ran cold. Eyes wide, she couldn't look at him, but she heard his signature heavy steps walk up the stairs and Izuku had to push down the urge to vomit. Slowly, the footsteps faded till Endeavor's door slammed closed, signaling the coast to be clear. Izuku's lungs in the air it always seemed to lose when he was near. She waited a minute before calling out to him. You can come out now, Izuku whispered, just in case. He popped his head out, looking around frantically, and he finally settled on Izuku. He's gone, Natsuo. Don't worry. The words came out a lot more sure than Izuku felt, but she put on her best all-might smile anyway. Tentatively, Natsuo emerged from the closet with extra wary glances. Now in the light, Izuku could see the tear streaks on his face and the subtle flush of his cheeks. His eyes came to rest on her now bloody hands filled with the shards of glass. I'm so sorry. It's okay, it really wasn't, but it wasn't his fault. You say things are okay even if they aren't, especially for children. That was what All Might would do. That was what she needed to do. Why'd you do that? It was my fault I broke the bowl. And why you got hurt? Deep sobs followed his whispered declaration, because even if Endeavor wasn't with them his presence still hung thick. Izuku stood up and placed the shards on the counter, trying to steady her hands without much success. Natsuo, this wasn't your fault. Your father. He's not a good man and you shouldn't have to pay the price for his anger and ego. She chose her next words carefully, and I did it because it was the right thing to do. He still looked frozen, he didn't even try to wipe the tears that cascaded down his face. Small things to do always helped her steady herself, so Izuku asked, could you grab the broom? Maybe this simple task could help dry the tears in his eyes, make his heart calm back down. Natsuo nodded and bit his lip as he went back to the pantry and grabbed the broom. Don't get too close, there are still a lot of little shards around that'll cut your feet. She should know. Her feet feel like, well, what she guessed fire felt like. Now with a broom and pan in hand, she carefully swept up the rest of the pieces as Natsuo watched on, still frozen like a deer in the headlights. Streaks of blood were now staining the broom and painting the floor, making more of a mess for her to clean up, but she could use that as an excuse to avoid Endeavor longer. A noise took her from her work. Heart hammering fast in her chest, she was about to move to shove Natsuo back into the pantry when she spotted a stalk of red-dipped hair in the doorframe. Unstiffening was hard when he had those eyes, but she stared curiously at Tuya, who seemed like he didn't know what to do. Tuya peeked around the corner with the first aid kit in hand and a grimace on his face. Without saying anything, he tiptoed over, not making any eye contact as he placed the kit on the countertop. He motioned for her to sit on a chair. She did so, albeit a little confused. His hostility never really had stopped until this moment. All the supplies were laid out, slight hands picked up the tweezers, and Tuya set to work. Izuku winced with every pull and every shard, but didn't let herself cry out. Silent tears ran down her cheeks. The disinfectant hurt even more, getting into every nook and cranny the glass had cut into her. But still she did not cry out, even if he wasn't here, she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. It was the little rebellions that kept them all sane. With practiced hands, Tuya wrapped up her feet and knees. The blood had seeped through the cloth, but there was little either of them could do about that. The whole time, Tuya kept his eyes anywhere but meeting her own. "Thank you for protecting Natsuo," was all Tuya said before getting the mop. "Come, Natsu, help me clean this up?" The younger boy nodded and gave Izuku a guilty look before ducking in shame as his eyes landed on her injuries. She was about to reply, when a thunderous voice hollered down from upstairs. "Izuku, get up here now." Everything in her froze. Both boys watched Izuku as she forced her lungs to inhale and exhale. Tentatively, she put pressure on her feet, and pain shot up both her legs lightning fast. But she couldn't sit back down, and kept placing one foot in front of another. A small hand steadied her. Looking down, she saw Natsuo helping her hobble to the stairs. "Thank you," he whispered. She tried to smile, but it came out crooked and fearful. Another loud echo. "Izuku! Coming," she called back, and she was glad for Natsuo next to her or she might have collapsed right there. At the staircase, she turned to him and whispered, "I'll be all right from here." He looked at her skeptically, tears threatening to fall. Now she had to put on her best smile. "It's gonna be okay." It wasn't, but she had to lie. And with that, she climbed up the stairs. After that day, Tuya didn't stare at her with hatred burning, though he barely looked at her at all. While all that was a small step in the right direction, he at least understood now that she wasn't a threat to him. They were learning to live with one another, both against their will. She hadn't expected any kind of call on her new phone. She didn't have any friends, maybe school friends, but they hadn't seemed broken up that she was leaving school, or any relatives that would call her. It kept buzzing away, so she ended up picking up. "Hello. Is this Mrs. Todoroki?" The voice sounded tired as they asked. It took her a couple of moments to realize that she was, in fact, Mrs. Todoroki. It had already been a month or more, but she still couldn't connect herself to this new name. "Yeah, this is her." "Well, this is the middle school calling. Tuya got into another fight this afternoon, and he is suspended for the next 3 days. We would like it if you could come pick him up at this time." She nodded even though she was home alone with a scrub brush in one hand and the other holding her phone. "Yes, I'll be there right away." "Thank you," and they promptly hung up. Endeavor must have already put her number as Tuya's emergency contact. No use having his name attached to kids he didn't want. Izuku went to go get ready. She was pretty sure no one knew that Tuya was the son of the number 4 hero. Though it was winter, it was mild enough for a light jacket. It was a swift walk to the middle school, and she climbed the stairs with ease to the main office. Izuku gently knocked on the doorframe to get the secretary's attention, and the woman let her into the lobby. "I'm here for Tuya Todoroki." The lady gave her a quick once-over and looked at her skeptically. "And you are?" She hoped the blush of shame didn't reach her cheeks. She had always had a baby face, looking no more than 15. His stepmom. Izuku could feel her judgment all the way from here. Not that she blamed her. She remembered her own stepmom making fun of the young women they would see on the street attached to older men, marrying them only for money, a little ironic when she was the second wife and 12 years younger than Izuku's semi-wealthy father. Some silence passed between them while the woman contemplated that answer. "Go to the second door on the right." Izuku nodded in thanks, but kept her lips tightly shut. The door was ajar as she entered. Tuya sat slouched on the chair across the desk from whom Izuku assumed was the principal. "Mrs. Todoroki, take a seat." The principal motioned to the chair next to Tuya. Now sitting, Izuku folded her hands in her lap as politely as possible. She crossed her legs too just to appear more eloquent. "So what seems to be the problem?" Granted. She already knew, it just seemed like the kind of thing an adult would say in this situation. Todoroki here broke another student's nose. There was a long beat of silence as the principal waited for a reply. "Are you going to explain yourself?" The man gave a pointed look at Tuya, gesturing toward Izuku to begin. "The kid stepped on my shoe like a little beach." Tuya crossed his arms to put more effort into his aloofness. Couldn't even take a punch like a real man. Izuku suppressed a sigh, but the principal didn't. "Todoroki." The man pinched his nose. We are at the ends of our rope. You have gotten into fights, set things on fire, hurt people. Within the last couple of months it's all started to escalate, and this is your last chance to sharpen up or we'll have to expel you. Tuya didn't say anything more. Mrs. Todoroki, that was her name now, no matter how sick to her stomach that made her. This is our last warning. Yes. He will do better, she answered, and Tuya scoffed. Did he realize the opportunities to get away that he was throwing away? This was his way out, and he was shutting that door. Okay, you two can go. Remember, Todoroki, don't screw this up. As soon as they left school grounds, Izuku whirled around to face Tuya. Since you're suspended, you can help me clean. Tuya groaned as if the world was crashing down. Come on, Izuku. That's stupid, he kicked a rock on the road. Well, if you don't stop punching random kids at school for no good reason, you're gonna be cleaning a lot more, so watch yourself. Izuku snapped. The jealousy and burning anger moved her mouth into a scowl. Tuya got to go to school, had the opportunity to be and do something, and he was throwing it all away. For what? Quick anger and the sweet taste of blood? Grumbles followed, but Tuya didn't say anything more till they got back to the estate. Izuku handed him a brush and bucket, a little forcefully. And he followed her to the kitchen, their first task of many. Do you realize what you're doing to yourself? She growled, hands on hips. All the words had bubbled up in a blinding anger. It's none of your business. Tuya snarled right back. School is your way out. This is how you can escape. So this is my business. Tuya's mouth snapped shut, though his teeth were still barred. So just stop getting into fights, get your degree, and run as far as you can. He didn't say anything more and just scrubbed the floor as hard as he could. Izuku followed suit, both of their anger stewing. Finally, after some minutes of constant scrubbing, Tuya blurted out, Don't you want to leave too? Why don't you just leave? You're an adult, and you have no kids with him yet. So why can't you just run as far as you can? It's not that simple, Tuya. Why isn't it? Endeavor isn't just gonna let me go. He wants my quirk no matter what. Izuku let out a stuttering breath. His grip was too tight, even when he wasn't there. And I'm technically a minor. He looked confused at that word, so she clarified. A child in the eyes of the law, and so I couldn't get far. I don't even have my papers or ID, either my father or Endeavor has them. A somber sort of silence followed after, only filled with the sound of brushes on tile. Tuya broke the quiet again. What would you do if you weren't stuck here? Well, I would probably be studying to get a scholarship. My father had said that as soon as I turned 18, I'd be on my own. She stopped her scrubbing, hoping the shakiness in her eyes didn't follow to her hands. I wanted to be a hero, but he wouldn't pay the fees or let me apply to any of the schools, so my plan was to get scholarships to go to America, since a lot of their hero schools are colleges, and I'd become a firefighter there. My quirk isn't super flashy, but every quirk has its uses. Maybe I could have saved people. In an almost tentative voice, Tuya asked, Do you want to be a hero now? He couldn't meet her eyes and continued to run the rag over the same clean spot. Izuku was in a breath at the question. Did she? The next words she spoke were soft. I just want to save people. Shaking her head to try stopping the thoughts that came along with that statement, she turned to Tuya. How about you? Do you still want to be a hero? He stirred the water in the bucket, over and over, refusing to look anywhere else. He let out an angry, no, and tugging on his shirt over the old and new scars on his arms, he effectively ended the conversation. They didn't speak for the rest of the time as they finished cleaning the floor. Next was the bathrooms. Izuku gathered the rest of the supplies while Tuya stayed back. When she returned to the bathroom, Tuya was staring at his reflection in the mirror with a hard scowl on his face. What are you doing there? She tilted her head as she looked at Tuya through the mirror. My hair is dumb, he said to himself mostly. Izuku thought about it for a moment. I can change your hair. A bit if you want. Maybe not permanently, but I can do something with it. You see what I do to Fuyumi's hair each morning. Startled, he rubbed his neck. Something passed over his face that Izuku couldn't decipher. I don't think my hair can go into braids. He tugged at a clump of hair in his face. But can you really do something with it? Yeah, I can. How do you want it? Every word was accompanied by a toothy smile. Leaning down to be level with him, he was extremely small for his age. Izuku looked at Tuya through the mirror as he replied. I want it spiky. I want to look like a white hedgehog. My hair is too fluffy right now. With a chuckle of fondness, Izuku straightened back up. I think I can do that. After what was probably an hour, Izuku was finished with the hair gel she found in the pantry. Each and every hair was covered, and Izuku quite proudly declared that his head did now indeed look like a hedgehog. But you can open your eyes now. Opening one eye first, Tuya stared at his reflection, his expression indecipherable. I can take the spray out if you don't like it, Izuku added just in case. Tuya was always hard to read when he wasn't angry. I look awesome, he said, with a tinge of a smile. Cleaning the bathroom was quiet, but it held none of the previous malice. Just the soft sounds and smell of cleaning bleach. Izuku even started singing the All Might theme song under her breath as she worked. Is that the song from All Might's show? Tuya piped up. Putting the finishing touches on the bathroom, she replied, yeah. It was my favorite show when I was young. Tuya gathered up all his dirty rags and brushes and put them in the bucket. I like his show, especially when everyone praises him for being number one and the best in the whole world. A spiteful sort of love for the concept for someone who could beat his father, not that she blamed him. It was a nice thought that Endeavor would never be number one as long as All Might lived. I have an All Might figure in my room. Really? Can I see? He looked surprised. They could take a break. Yeah. Izuku had hidden all her little valuables, like the pictures of her mom, the last quirk analysis notebook she had before her father had thrown them all out citing bad behavior, and of course her All Might figurine, in a little box she had put away in her closet. Opening it up always gave her a rush of happiness, and today was no exception. She riffled through the pictures and felt the toy at the bottom. Tuya peered over her shoulder as she pulled it out. She handed it to him and hesitantly he took it from her. Trancing the lines of his face with his finger, Tuya flipped it over and over in his hand. This is pretty cool. How did you even get it in here? Endeavor would have thrown a fit. I have my ways. It sounded better than the sheer luck of forgetting it was in her pocket and it going through the wash. A couple of seconds passed before he gave it back to Izuku, who moved it under the pictures and notebook, just in case. Who's that? Tuya pointed to the picture of her and her mom on a pier, ice cream in hand on a warm summer day. Izuku passed the picture of her mother to Tuya. That's my mom. Something soured on Tuya's face. Why do you have a picture of someone who forced you to come here? Every word was accusatory. She died when I was 12 and I moved to my dad's. It was sorta sweet that Tuya had felt so passionately about that. He's the one who made me come here. His mouth was still a hard line as he stared intently with his ice blue eyes. You look like her, he added as he passed it back to her. Izuku smiled, as much as it hurt to know that most every person felt that way. It was nice to know there would always be a part of her mom in her. Thank you. She's one of the bravest people I've ever met. You're pretty brave too, he said quietly, and he sounded sincere. Tuya didn't seem like the person to lie to make others feel better. She was taken aback. Isuku didn't find herself brave in any way. If she were, things maybe would have turned out different. With the picture back in her hands, she traced the edges, not looking directly at the photo. Thanks, but I don't think that's very true. An awkward silence followed before Tuya spoke up again. Want to see a picture of my mom? Izuku was a little shocked, but she nodded anyway. The curiosity of what this woman looked like was really getting to her. Tuya led her to his room and pulled out a box. This is my mom. Her name's Rei. With a delicate grip, he pulled out the first picture. The woman had long, white hair, falling in neat strands. Her hands held onto a baby with fiery red hair and a big smile. Rei smiled back at the child with a kind of love in her eyes that transcended this mere photo. A kind of love that doesn't get snuffed out. Her heart fell into her stomach. Who's that? Izuku pointed to the child being cradled by his mother. What happened to this fifth child? That's me. It's kinda weird to see myself with red hair again. Izuku let out a sigh of relief. Though, she was now really curious on why his hair was turning white. He was 12, not 60. So it just changed colors? Is that your quirk? Can you only change half of your hair? The hair thing, I don't know what that is. My quirk is cremation. Can I see? Izuku eagerness pulled a smile to her face. Oh, how she had missed dissecting quirks, a thing she didn't have time to do between exams, chores, and intense studying. Tuya gave her a look, but he activated his quirk anyway. Blue flames, soft and delicate, danced on his fingertips, carefully kept away from the white jacket he always wore. You can make blue flames. I'm guessing that it's due to the high heat and not any sort of element influencing the color. So fascinating. She wanted to say more but held her tongue. She was getting better at that. It's his quirk. It's not fascinating, he spat. If I make it any bigger, I'll burn myself. It's a stupid quirk for my weak body. Hesitantly, Izuku's hand over his. The self-hatred in every word he said rang in her mind. Izuku put her hand over his, effectively cutting out most of the flames, and he was ice cold. That's your quirk, Tuya. No one else's. It's his. Don't you get it? It's his, not mine. This quirk that wasn't made for me. The flames grew with his rising voice, right down his palm, almost liking his shirt. With Izuku's other hand she smothered the fire. But it's still yours, Tuya, it's you. Fire doesn't just burn out all the bad, it can do amazing things. He brought up his knees, whatever. An awkward few moments passed before Izuku slapped her legs and got up. Okay, she declared, let's get back to cleaning. Tuya groaned and practically melted onto the floor in a dramatic fashion. The rest of the morning, they cleaned in an uneasy silence. Soon enough, it was about time to eat lunch, which gave Izuku an idea. Tuya sat at the table while Izuku pulled out some of the leftovers and plopped them into bowls and brought them over to him. The curry is cold, she told him. The curry is cold? Yeah. Good thing you have a quirk that can heat things up. The idea had come from Endeavor of all places, but she wasn't gonna tell him that. We also have a stove. Come on, she sat next to him. Fire can do so many good things. I don't want you to forget that. He frowned at the curry as if it personally offended him and didn't say anything. Izuku paused for a bit, thinking on how to best convey what she wanted to. Tuya, can you? Look at me? He peeked out of the corner of his eye and between the whitening strands of hair. I want to help you. Why do you want to help me? He snapped back, baring his teeth. Because it's the right thing to do. This isn't helping, all my quirk does is turn things to ash. That's why we start small. According to all the quirk theory books she had read, that was the best way to get a child acclimated to their quirk. Tuya tilted his head as if that was a new concept. And you want me to start with curry? Fire isn't just meant to burn, she repeated. Easy enough for you to say, you can't even get burnt. You don't have his quirk. It's your quirk. Somehow, that'd be worse, he muttered under his breath, poking his cold curry. Tuya, your quirk hurts you because it's turned up to 100 all the time. But if you start at 1, like you did when you showed me, you could still live with it without it constantly hurting you. The aim is to control, not power. And maybe he could start to not hate a part of himself that was out of his control. Every kid has trouble with their quirk. Like with her when she got her quirk. Izuku had hated it and all it stood for. It wasn't a hero's quirk, so why have a quirk at all? She couldn't save anyone with it, she thought. Her mom changed her mind though, by showing her videos of firefighters and explaining to her that she could be a hero. There was always something that could be done, however small. Tuya's quirk, however destructive, was still a quirk that could be trained like any other. Izuku was no quirk counselor, but her late obsession did make her pretty knowledgeable on the subject. Control, not power, was the way to go. This was how he'd be able to live with his quirk, at least, and the burns on his arms wouldn't happen anymore. So did you just slowly start to set yourself on fire before you were fireproof? Nope, my quirk is more passive than anything. But the trouble I did have was getting really cold, and since only heat up to 98 degrees could affect me. It was dangerous if I got too cold too fast and I could have died. But anyway, I used to read quirk theory books for fun, so this process should work. Tuya stabbed a piece of meat with his chopstick. Izuku rolled her eyes, but she couldn't keep the smile off her face. He wasn't fighting it anymore. This would work. It didn't work. Well, at least it didn't work that day. Plus ultra. After 4 bowls of burnt curry, Thank God that they didn't have fire alarms in their house or they would have been blaring right then. Izuku placed the last one in the garbage. See, it doesn't work, Izuku, so just give up. My quirk is a curse, and won't do anything good. He crossed his arms and slumped in his chair in defeat. Don't say that, Izuku reassured. This was only the first try. You'll get it. She placed the bowl in the sink to soak with the others. There was gonna be a lot of scrubbing later. And I'll be right there just in case. She gave her best all-might smile, willing it to inspire some hope. Tuya slumped down even farther into the chair, his chin meeting his chest. Whatever. The timer on her phone told her it was time to go. Walking towards the doorway, she looked behind her. Come on, let's go get your siblings. Tuya got up and joined her. Why do you insist on walking with us? It's not like we can't ourselves. But it wasn't because she was told to. She would have done it anyway. I guess it gets me out of the house. And plus, I like spending time with you guys. Tuya raised an eyebrow. Even you. Hey. He playfully shoved her as she buttoned her jacket. Short laughs passed through both of them as they closed the door behind them. They only had to visit the elementary school, which made things quicker. While standing on the sidewalks with the other parents waiting for the kids to be let out, Tuya turned to her. What if you could, no problems, no roadblocks, run away right now? The question took her by surprise. The instinct in her told her she would sprint to the other side of the world. But she had to stop herself, because she knew she wouldn't. Endeavor would still be there, and so would his children, suffering. She had to be their hero. Would be their hero and smile through it all. But all that aside, even if she ran, she was replaceable, just as Rei was. She couldn't condemn another woman to this fate. So she would grin and bear it. Her answer on the cusp of her lips. The abridged version, at least, and she was about to respond when a small body crashed into her legs. Izuku, the youngest Todoroki, exclaimed. School was really bringing him out of his shell, at least around Izuku. He still has yet to make any friends. Surprised, she smiled down at him, not really sure what to do. Hey there. Shudo raised both of his hands high, a motion for her to pick him up. Could she really refuse such a request? So she lifted him up and he clung on, his legs swaying slightly and a small smile traced his lips. The geography bee is next week? Natsuo rolled his eyes. He doesn't realize he's not gonna be able to be in it. And anyway, I could totally beat him. What? Shuto swiveled around in her arms. His smile was replaced by a frown. With gentle patience, Fuyumi assured him. You'll probably get to participate next year. I think first graders have their own. Why not this year? Shudo's lips started to wobble. It's a big kid thing. Izuku supplied. Shudo buried his head into Izuku's shoulder and didn't say anything more, only letting out a couple of sniffles. She patted his back to try and calm him down. Let's go get Tuya, Natsuo suggested then. I'm literally right here. Tuya called from behind him. Whirling around, their eyes met and Natsuo burst out laughing. Fuyumi too had to cover her mouth, but little giggles escaped. Shut up. Tuya ran at him, trying to knock him over or do any sort of damage, but he was too small and Natsuo just continued to wheeze. You look like you got zapped, he got out between hard laughs. Tuya, at this point, had given up trying to push down his brother and instead stormed off ahead, towards the house. Shudo lifted his head. I like your hair, Tuya. You don't get to like it, oh, perfect one. And your hair is even more. Tuya mocked, not looking back as they all started off down the street behind him. The insult didn't faze Shudo one bit. You look like a hedgehog, Shuto clarified as if that was any better. Natsuo started to laugh even harder, and Fuyumi gave up trying to stifle herself. Tuya stopped and tugged on his hair a bit. Thanks, I guess. Once Izuku caught up to him, she added, I think you look pretty cool, you know? He couldn't meet her in the eye, but replied anyway. Thanks, he muttered. No you don't. Natsuo chimed in. She's LA. Shut up. I don't know why I have to go to this stupid geography bee. I bet there aren't gonna be any actual bees. Tuya complained as he leaned on the bathroom door frame while Izuku tried to style her hair. It just wouldn't sit right in any way she put it to match the nice-ish dress she wore. You gotta support your siblings. Wouldn't Natsuo get sad if you didn't come and cheer him on? With bobby pins in her mouth, it came out a little jumbled as she put half her hair in a bun. A humph from Tuya was all Izuku got as an answer. They said there is gonna be a pizza party after. And they also said that the families are invited as well. That was what the email she had gotten said at least. A streak of white ran past, and he wasn't wearing a tie. Natsuo dashed down the hallway as Izuku stuck her head out and yelled, "There better be a tie around your neck before we go." All he did was give her a thumbs up as he rounded the corner to do whatever hyper 7-year-olds do. "You should keep your hair up like that, you look like your mom," Tuya said. Pausing, Izuku really looked at herself in the mirror. She did look like her mom. It made her stand a little taller and feel a little braver. Before she could thank him, Fuyumi poked her head into the bathroom. She had already been dressed for the event since this morning in her anticipation. "Could you do my hair?" she asked with a tentative voice, fiddling with the hem of her dress. "Always," and Izuku motioned her over to stand in front of the mirror. A wide smile squished her eyes as moved around Tuya and stood in front of Izuku. "Can I have twin braids? Like pigtails?" "Of course." Izuku got out the brush and started to bring it through her hair. "Hey, can I try?" Tuya. Surprised, Izuku doesn't say anything, just looked to Fuyumi who nodded vehemently and Izuku followed suit. The two sides of her hair were already divided up for the pigtails. On the other side he grabbed gently, waiting for instructions. "Okay, you start with 3 strands, Izuku demonstrated and Tuya did the same to his side. "And bring one of the outside strands to the middle." "Great job." Slowly but surely Tuya brought the braid together. A faint smirk of accomplishment traced his lips as he held the finished product together. "Okay, so here's the ponytail." Izuku handed it to him and she was about to instruct him on how to tie it and how to put a ribbon over it, but Fuyumi spoke up. "I invited Dad to come tonight." She blurted out as if she had been holding that in for a long time. Everything was still, every breath. Then Tuya's hand went alight in blue fury. "Tuya." Izuku wrapped her hands around the flames that climbed up Fuyumi's braid to smother them out. At the same time, Fuyumi exclaimed, "My hair." Fuyumi started to cry as she saw what was left of her hair in the mirror, only to about her shoulders. The ash of her hair fell to the floor, and Izuku had to let out a breath that she hadn't been burnt in the process. The sour look on his face showed only a tinge of regret. "Why did you invite Endeavor?" Ignoring the question directed at Fuyumi, Izuku interjected. "Get out, we are going to have a discussion before we leave about what you did." "Fine. Whatever, it was her fault," he said as if he hadn't almost burnt his sister. "It was not Tuya and you know it. Own up to what you did." This rising anger in her voice would do her nothing but it was fueling her words. Smoke snaked between his fingers as he marched out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. Izuku sighed and turned her attention to Fuyumi who was still bawling. The smell of singed hair hung heavy in the air. "It's okay, I can fix it, hair could be managed." She pushed down the disgust that Fuyumi had wanted Endeavor in any part. They could talk about that when she calmed down. Fuyumi tried to wipe the tears away but they kept on coming. "How?" a hiccuping sob. "How?" "I'll trim it so it's even." Izuku started to comb her fingers through Fuyumi's hair, which seemed to calm her down somewhat as her sobs became whimpers. An easy fix, well, she hoped it was. Never in her life had Izuku cut someone's hair, but she had to try. This was supposed to be Fuyumi's night. She rummaged in a drawer, she knew where everything was now, a side effect of living there for some months. With the scissors now in hand, Izuku started with cutting off the charred, black bits that hadn't been turned to ash. You know he's not gonna come. Especially since it's the hero ranking ceremony tonight. Fuyumi flinched a little. Okay, Izuku needed to sound less mad. "So why did you invite your father?" She kept her tone neutral this time. Fuyumi bit her lip as she stared at Izuku's hands working their way through her hair. "I just want Dad to see me do good, you know, so he'll want to do more things with me." Izuku pursed her lips. "I know you want to have a dad that is there for you, like the ones on TV," she could relate. "But sometimes that doesn't work out and it isn't your fault. It's his. It's his loss that he can't see he has a smart, appealing daughter right here in front of him." Fuyumi said nothing, just kept staring at her changing reflection in the mirror at the snip of the scissors. And this is gonna be yours and Natsuo's night, not his. Let him have his stupid hero ranking ceremony, it's not like he'll ever beat All Might, which filled her with a sick satisfaction. Do you think if I had a better quirk then he would come? She couldn't look her in the eye. Izuku didn't want to think of what he would do to her if Fuyumi had a good quirk. She could very well end up like her, that thought made her queasy. I don't know. But you already have an amazing quirk already. Fuyumi didn't reply and the sound of the scissors was the only thing that filled the room. Soon enough her hair was just about even and Izuku cut the last strand off. Okay, I think it's all done. Fuyumi, it seemed, had not been paying attention, and she looked at her new hair and started to tear up. I want my old hair back. There was nothing that could be done. I'm sorry. He's so mean. Izuku had never seen her so angry, her tears were now white-hot. I just want to freeze his face off. Let's not do that. Fingers wove through her hair to try and maybe style it a little different, but Fuyumi was still upset. Izuku kept doing it in hopes that it would calm her down some. Slowly but surely her tears stopped and Izuku wiped the ones still left. Why don't you practice a bit before we leave? I need to go talk to Tuya. She didn't reply. Izuku ran her fingers through her trimmed hair once last time before steeled herself to. He was easy to find, sitting in his room and bouncing a ball to see how high he could get. If he noticed Izuku in the doorway, he didn't give any indication. Tuya, what you did was wrong. Izuku finally spoke up. So what? Another bounce of the ball. So what? She repeated, baffled. You burnt your sister's hair and could have very well burnt her too. Your anger is valid, but do not, I repeat, do not take it out on her or others. A pause. And also you're grounded. Phew. Tuya let the ball roll away. Don't swear at me. This is your sister's and brother's night, so you better be on your best behavior. And you're grounded for 2 weeks. I don't care. She had it coming. Izuku's words were hard. You're acting like him. So stop. Tuya froze in his snarl. Izuku felt a little guilty saying that, but she went on, her voice still stone. He takes his anger out on us, or villains, or whoever. So don't be like him. Please. His fists were clenched harder now, smoking and spitting blue flames. Izuku sighed and rubbed her face. Just get ready to go, you have 5 minutes. She shut the door behind her. Izuku already had her jacket on, ready to go. Shudo was the only one ready, and Izuku counted her blessing that he didn't put up any sort of fuss when she made him dress nicely. She didn't think she could have handled that after her fight with Tuya. She was about to call out for them, but Natsuo came around the corner, with tie in hand and Tuya sulking behind him. Come here, Natsuo, I'll fix your tie. He did so without any complaining or any real fight. The nerves must have really gotten to him. Was a war and a half to even get him to wear one to school. They were silent while she looped and finished it off. It was terrible, but no one in this house knew any better. All done. She fixed his collar and dusted off his shoulders. So handsome, you're gonna do great. He just shrugged. Normally he was so self-assured, or at least acted like it. Hey, Izuku gently put her hand under his chin to get him to look at her. Go out there and be yourself. I believe in you. It took him a moment to get the joke, but when he did, his nervous demeanor shifted as he laughed hard. That's so dumb, he said between giggles. Then why are you laughing at it? Izuku asked with a smile. I'm not. He covered his mouth, but little laughs escaped and Izuku raised an eyebrow. Before she could goad him on further, to keep his spirits up, Fuyumi walked down the stairs. Her frown was stapled on as her eyes were red from crying still, fists balled at her side. Natsuo noticed her hair, eyes alight in mischief, and he opened his mouth, but Izuku shot him a look and he clamped it shut. You ready, Fuyumi? Izuku asked with a gentle touch when she made it down the stairs. Not saying anything, she nodded. The walk to the elementary school was mostly silent save for Izuku quizzing Natsuo a couple of times. He gave the answers but didn't say anything else, twisting his hands into each other. Fuyumi didn't answer, even though she knew all the questions. She was too busy staring holes through Tuya to even try. As she signed them in, Natsuo and Fuyumi were ushered with the other kids. Izuku gave them one last thumbs up before they all left to go get ready. Okay guys. Izuku turned to Tuya and Shudo. Let's go find some seats. They had been a little late, but there were plenty of seats left. As soon as they sat down, the lights dimmed and the sixth graders came onto the stage, sitting on metal chairs in rows. Fuyumi was the first one called up after the teacher had introduced them all. Walking up all nervous, Fuyumi stood in front of the mic. The question was asked and Fuyumi paused in thought. She bit her lip before answering. Tokyo. You are right. Izuku clapped loudly, the only one doing so. The claps slowly petered out as she embarrassingly put her hands back onto her lap, cheeks flushed. The people around her looking at her. Tuya looked like was gonna say something snarky, but he held his tongue. Izuku's eyes kept on Fuyumi as she stepped back to her seat with a straighter back. Question after question was asked and Fuyumi kept knocking them right out of the park. Some of them Izuku remembered quizzing her on in their spare moments, like while cooking, before bed, or their daily routine of braiding hair. Soon it was only her and some other kid left, all the empty chairs framing them in their near victory. Her opponent walked up and confidently answered the next question. Sorry, but that is the wrong answer. The correct answer is the blue and white Nile. The kid ran off crying, leaving Fuyumi on stage, the sole victor. She sat in her seat, concerned for her peer, written all over her face, but Izuku could tell she was holding back a smile. This win was hers. Well, that concludes our 6th grade round. Make sure to stick around for the medal ceremony. Let's give a round of applause to our winner, Fuyumi Todoroki. Izuku took a lot of pride that she was clapping the loudest, probably a little obnoxiously so. Shudo didn't really understand what was going on but tried to join in, but Tuya kept his arms firmly crossed. With a quick bow, Fuyumi was ushered off stage for the 5th graders to have their turn. It was a while before it was Natsuo's group's turn. Shudo was already starting to doze off. His grade filed onto the stage, Natsuo right in the middle. Izuku waved to him on stage. Seeing her, he waved back with a wide smile. Natsuo wasn't called up till almost dead last for his question, though every single kid was still left on the stage. The teacher asked him his question as he stood by the mic, and immediately Natsuo blurted out, "China. Sorry buddy, but that is not the right answer. Please step off the stage." Natsuo nodded as he stared at the floor on his way out and out of sight. The production moved quickly and the next kid was called up. Tuya stood up and moved past Izuku. She didn't stop him as he exited the row and went to go find Natsuo. She didn't see them till after the award ceremony, which Izuku proudly clapped the loudest at when Fuyumi got her medal. Natsuo was looking a lot better. His eyes were red but he was grinning genuinely. He even had the Pratiseptaean medal around his neck. "Get in for a picture, all of you," Izuku said, pulling out her phone. Tuya purposefully stepped back. "Even you Tuya. Get on over there Shuto." He did so and ran over, grabbing Fuyumi's shirt. Tuya was a little more reluctant. "Thank you." They all stood there, Fuyumi and Tuya purposefully not next to each other. Izuku motioned them closer together. "Come on guys. Get in close. Bring up those medals." Natsuo and Fuyumi did as such, their smiles growing. "Shuto, settle down sweetheart." By Fuyumi's strength alone he stood still. "Okay good." Clicking the button, the photo showed up on the screen. "I wanna see." Shudo came bounding back to her and she knelt down to show him as the rest of his siblings followed. Natsuo whined as he saw it. "My eyes were closed." "Don't worry, it's still a good picture. We can take another one if you want." Izuku reassured him but he just whined more dramatically. Fuyumi spoke up next. "My hair doesn't look that bad," tucking a piece of hair behind her ear. "You should thank me then," Tuya commented. "Why?" She was about to blow and Izuku physically had to separate them. "How about I freeze all your hair off and see how you like it?" Tuya just stuck out his tongue, real mature. Izuku nervously piped up. "The pizza party is starting, why don't we go get some before all the good stuff is gone?" That seemed to be enough to get them to stop for the time being. Pizza solved a lot of things, so maybe it would distract them enough where they wouldn't try to rip each other's throats out. With one last glance at the photo on her phone, she saw every single one of their faces smiling, even Tuya's. It was rare to see him smile at all. Izuku was glad she had his and the others immortalized in this moment of peace. Like the calm before the next wave crashed on shore. They had been in the middle of the pack and there were still good flavors left. They picked their slices. Natsuo, seeing some friends from school, took off in that direction, nearly dropping his pizza but catching it at the last minute. A group of kids at a table who had been on stage with Fuyumi waved over to them. Fuyumi stood dead in her tracks and looked up at Izuku. Chuckling, Izuku put a hand on her back. Go on. Nervously, she put one foot in front of the other. Shudo grabbed her hand as if to steady her and she gave him a kind smile as they made their way to the other kids. One of the girls complimented Fuyumi's hair and she blushed as some of the other kids joined in. Izuku was about to find somewhere for herself to sit. Tuya had already dipped. She couldn't blame him, she was still pretty angry at him for what he did earlier this evening. A blonde woman walked up to her, smiling bright, before Izuku could find a table. So which one is your sibling? I haven't seen you around here. A pause, she debated lying in her head, but it would just lead to more problems. Down the road. I'm actually Natsuo and Fuyumi Todoroki's stepmom. The lady was taken aback for a moment before her lipstick, all red and shiny, stretched over a smile. Oh, well, I didn't see a ring. Did Endeavor even give her a ring? She couldn't remember. Not that she would willingly wear it. A dark-haired lady came up from behind the other woman and looked down on Izuku. So Mr. Todoroki got a new wife. The lady gave her a once-over. And a much younger one at that. The blonde woman piped up. I was never close to Rei, she was kinda a loner. Not that I've seen Rei in a couple years. I do wonder how she's doing. Not good, she was in a mental hospital due to her ex-husband. She's divorced, that's how. A laugh. Anyway, is your husband around? I want to meet him after all these years. He didn't come. And thank God for that. Typical. The dark-haired woman said with a wave of her hand. The blonde woman chimed in, well, at least I asked. She flipped her hair to her other shoulder effortlessly. I'm Yamada, by the way. Ito. The other answered. I'm Todoroki. They already knew that, but she didn't feel like giving her first name to these women. It seemed too personal. Welcome. Yamada exclaimed, clapping Izuku on the back. Izuku tried not to react. Thanks. What else was she supposed to say? Your skin is so smooth. The woman grabbed her face and Izuku flinched back. Her grip wasn't tight like his, but she couldn't stop the primal rush of fear that ran through her. Yamada, obvious, continued to talk. What products do you use? I have to have them. Nothing. Izuku said through squished cheeks. And finally she let go at that with a disappointed sound. Izuku's heart rate was still through the roof. God, Yamada, you are getting desperate? Ito chided in a dry tone. It's not my fault I have to compare myself to Mitsuki freaking Bakugo every kindergarten event I go to. I don't have a quirk where my skin is permanently soft and gorgeous. She whined, fidgeting with her hair to straighten it. Mitsuki Bakugo? The quirk sounded similar, but the Mitsuki Bakugo's quirk was a sort of chemical she secreted that kept her skin smooth amongst other things. Izuku couldn't keep the quiver from her voice. That had been her mother's best friend. If this was the same woman, she couldn't see Izuku like this. Yamada tilted her head. You know her? Lying through her teeth, Izuku waved her hands defensively. I think I've just heard of her. Everyone's heard of Bakugo. Ito chuckled. We'd need earphones to not? Yamada laughed. Yeah, it was the same Mitsuki Bakugo. What would she think if she could see Izuku now? She would probably be pretty disgusted. Ito continued. And her modeling career, she means her husband just gets her into those magazines. That's another place you may have heard of her. Anyway, welcome to our school. We hope to see Rei here too, said Yamada. Hope there's no bad blood. By the tone of her voice, Izuku could tell she hoped there was. It was nice to meet you. With a wave, they left her as they mingled with the other adults. Izuku didn't belong with these put-together adults. She wasn't even one technically, so she found a table and sat alone. It felt like high school all over again. And she ate her oily cheese pizza in her own bubble of silence. She had long since finished her pizza when Shudo pulled on her dress. I want to go to sleep now. At least he knew what he wanted. Where are your siblings? Izuku scooped him up onto her lap and he immediately rested his head on her shoulders and sighed like he hadn't slept in years, the little drama king. He pointed to where they were surrounded by kids their own age, talking and laughing. Well, Fuyumi and Natsuo were still with their respective grade-aged friends. Tuya was in a corner devouring another piece of pizza alone, glaring at anyone who came too close, like a dog guarding his food. They could wait. Fuyumi and Natsuo deserved to have more time with their peers. Shudo brought a thumb to his mouth as he stared off into space with half-lidded eyes. Should she make him stop doing that? She'd have to Google that for later. I'm glad you're here, he said into her jacket. Izuku knew there was no malice in those words, and in any other situation it would probably be reassuring, heartwarming. And it did warm her heart, metaphorically of course, but the dread of that she was stuck here overtook that soft emotion. Tilting her head at the boy, she questioned, "What do you mean by that?" and scooted him up a little so he was more comfortable. "I don't have to train anymore." Izuku did her best to keep her breathing steady. "Train?" He yawned big and wide. "It hurt, a super lot. Mom tried to help but she was sick most of the time. That's what Fuyumi told me." "Who did you train with?" The answer was already in her mind. He wanted me to be a hero and beat All Might. "Not anymore though, I'm a back truck." "A backup?" "Yeah, that." His eyes were already closed and the conversation had ended. His gentle breathing was calming in a way she didn't understand. Eyes drooping down, sleep sounded nice. Shudo had the right idea. She didn't sleep well the last few nights. Endeavor had been home. She hadn't realized she had fallen asleep till Natsuo was shaking her shoulder and she sat upright in the chair, startling Shudo awake as well. "Good morning, sleepyheads," Natsuo exclaimed with Tuya standing behind him with his arms crossed. "But it's nighttime." Shudo rubbed his eyes. Tuya rolled his eyes while he said, "It's an expression." "Anyways, let's get going," said Natsuo. "I'm gonna hang this medal on my wall. First I'm gonna need to figure out how to use a hammer first though." Tuya clenched his hands harder. The sour look was back on his face. But he made a point to not let Natsuo see. Yawning, her muscles stretched as she stood up. Shudo, still sleepy, clung to her like a koala. "Where's Fuyumi?" "Speak of the devil." Fuyumi looked in a much better mood. She strode over, all smiles and dimples, her first-place medal still dangled from her neck. With all of them there, Izuku declared, "I think we should get ice cream to celebrate." She had the credit card for groceries or other household things in her purse. Some ice cream couldn't hurt, that counted as food. Loopholes. "But I got last place?" Natsuo tilted his head. "So why do I get ice cream?" "You tried your best and worked very hard, that's why." "Come on." She started to chant, "Ice cream, ice cream, ice cream, ice cream." They all chanted together. Even Shudo, who had been energized to the waking world by the mere thought, ready to run there if need be. The nearest ice cream place according to Izuku's phone was an All Might-themed one. It was the Little Rebellions that really counted. It was a short walk there, though it chilled her to her bones still even with her heavy coat and many layers. When they got there the place was practically empty, just a couple of employees and a few other customers mingled around the small room. The TV in the corner played the hero ranking ceremony. Izuku used to watch it religiously, decorating full pages of notes and theories on how it would go. Obviously, All Might was always number one. And will always be. The background music that played was the All Might theme song, which brought a smile to Izuku's face. There wasn't even a line, so the kids smashed their faces against the glass, discussing the flavors and their silly All Might themed names. "Tuya, you're still grounded. That means no ice cream. How is that fair? You burnt your sister's hair on purpose today." He shrugged his shoulders as he crossed his arms. "So," he sounded so nonchalant. But he couldn't meet hers or Fuyumi's eyes and he bit his lip. "We are not having this conversation again right now." Izuku gritted out. The other kids list off what they want and they watch in anticipation as their ice cream is scooped and served. Izuku just stuck to water. Even the tables and chairs are All Might themed, which delighted Izuku to no end. They got one with his Silver Age costume ready for a Texas smash. They all sat down and started to go to town, well, all except Tuya and Izuku. "Want some of my ice cream?" Shudo offered Izuku, his hands sticky already as he held out the spoon for her. As much as she wanted to take the bite, she knew from experience how cold foods, then having to go outside in winter would end up due to her quirk. For such a minor quirk, it really has fed her whole life over, even the little things. No thank you. That was very kind of you though. My quirk would react badly. Shudo moved the spoon to his mouth and began to devour the rest of his Delaware caramel crunch, humming the All Might theme song as he went. And Izuku just sipped on her lukewarm water. And for the first time in his career, Endeavor has dropped a place to number 5 on the charts. The host said. Izuku had been absently listening to it in the background, but this brought it center stage in her mind. If Izuku had been swallowing water, she would have been choking. Every Todoroki froze. That now included Izuku. The host went on, but Izuku was too busy panicking to listen any further. Shudo though was ecstatic after the initial shock, whooping and smiling with his ice cream-covered face. Izuku exchanged a look with all the other kids who came to the same conclusion. There was going to hell to pay. The littlest Todoroki only then seemed to sense the mood and tilted his head in confusion and directed a question at Izuku. Why aren't you guys happy? Dad is losing. We're just gonna have to be more careful from now on. Dabbing her napkin on her tongue, she wiped the mess from his face. He tried to squirm away, but her arms were long enough and he couldn't escape. Shudo would surely get his face full of ice cream again, but it was more of a distracting measure than anything else. Tuya was muttering under his breath, brows furrowed. Natsuo was about to say something to him, maybe to reassure him or joke around to lighten the mood. He put a hand on Tuya's, but at the same time Tuya's quirk went off. He howled in pain as he fell off his seat, clutching his hand. Tuya was apologizing profusely, clutching his own hand to try and extinguish his fire. I didn't mean to. He tried to say, but his words fell on harsh sobs. I swear, Natsuo, his voice was pleading now. Already around the table, Izuku knelt next to Natsuo trying to see the damage to his hand. She practically had to pry it from him. It was a harsh red, clearly inflamed, but not too bad. Natsuo must have inherited some fire resistance. Izuku let out a sigh of relief. An employee had come over by then with a first aid kit in hand. Could I help in any way? Please. Izuku couldn't keep her eyes off Natsuo, as if she did he'd go up in smoke. Tears threatened to fall down Izuku's face. The person knelt down and slowly put the burn cream on as Natsuo winced hard. The uninjured hand found Izuku's and squeezed it hard as the bandages wrapped around his palm. Stray tears fell as the first aid kit was put away. I can get you a free ice cream if you want, the employee said as they stood up. Any flavor. Just don't tell my boss. That immediately stopped the tears. Can I get an All Might chocolate punch? What do you say? Izuku prodded, his hands still in hers. Please. The pause. And thank you for wrapping up my hand. And the ice cream. You got it. And you're welcome, kid. Sometimes it's hard to control our quirks. They quickly glanced at Tuya, who pointedly looked away, hands bunched in his shirt, hugging himself. With the ice cream in his good hand, it was as good a time as any to head out. The walk back was quiet. Shudo had already crashed from the sugar, out cold, so Izuku had to carry him. Natsuo and Tuya started to slow as they got closer to the house. I'm sorry for burning you. I didn't mean to. Izuku heard Tuya whisper. It's okay. At least you didn't burn my hair. Natsuo joked, but it got no laugh from Tuya. Hey, really, I'm okay, and I got extra ice cream too. So it's all good. A long stretch of silence followed. In a soft voice, Natsuo continued. I'll give you some. I won't tell Izuku. No, just eat your goddamn ice cream. Tuya snapped. It was totally quiet for the rest of the way back. Shudo was already asleep when she put him to bed. And the rest of them went about their nightly routines, though Izuku had seen Natsuo try and skirt around brushing his teeth, but she caught him and made him do it twice. Soon, she was alone and she was too wired to sleep, so maybe some milk and honey would help. That was what her mother had done for her. Walking down the stairs and into the large kitchen, she saw Tuya at the sink. Smoke swirled around him as the water ran, little blue light shimmered on the spout. What are you doing? Tuya scrunched up his shoulders and immediately shut off the water. Stuff. What kind of stuff? Izuku inquired as she got nearer. He sighed and fully turned towards her. I just need to get this quirk right. I don't want to hurt Natsuo or Fuyumi, even if she's stupid. I mean, I kinda did burn her hair on purpose. But it's just dash. He wiped his eyes. I guess I messed up. Your sister isn't stupid. That wasn't really the point of his statement, but Izuku defended her anyway. You're gonna need to say that apology to her, not just me. But I'm glad that you realized that. And I know in your heart you don't want to hurt them. But I could have, and I already did. Tuya's breathing is getting desperate. So please, you have to teach me to control his quirk. It's not his, Tuya. Izuku knelt down to his height. Goodness, he was small. It's yours. That's the first step here. Once you realize it's yours, it's easier because it's solely you. Then I'm the one who almost burnt 2 people in one day. At least now he seemed more apt to learn and slowly realizing that it is his own quirk, no matter how harsh that reality was. She gently put your hand on his cheek to get him to look at her. And we're gonna try and prevent that happening again. Okay? I'll be here every step of the way. His skin was ice cold. It was a strange combo with his quirk. You don't have to do this alone. Quickly glancing at her, his eyes darted away just as fast, but he nodded into her hand. One of the barely contained tears fell and Izuku quickly wiped it. Do you want to start some training now? She asked. He nodded again into her hand. Good thing they didn't have school tomorrow. It was already way past 10. We'll start out slow. They sat on the kitchen floor, crisscross applesauce across from each other. He lit one finger at a time. But he was getting increasingly frustrated and the flames grew to burn him. He'd swear and he'd start over. It was hard to see him go through so much pain. She wanted to urge him to stop, but the cold determination in his eye let her know that he wasn't going anywhere. Your quirk is tied to your emotions. Duh, he rolled his eyes. You think I didn't notice? Izuku sighed. How about music? What about it? Maybe it'll help. He opened and closed his mouth, deciding whatever snarky thing he was gonna say wasn't worth it. On Izuku's phone, she pulled up calming music on YouTube and let it play. Remember deep breaths. Like with the curry. Tuya rolled his eyes but did as he was told. A loud door slammed open. Izuku shot up, deer in the headlights, praying that it wasn't him but knowing better. There was nowhere to hide or nowhere to stash Tuya in time. What are you doing? Izuku whirled around to see Endeavor standing in the doorway. Tuya turned off the music. It was deafening quiet as Izuku tried to level her breathing. I'm just helping Tuya with his quirk, Izuku muttered out, purposefully sidestepping to put herself between Tuya and him. Stop the effing mumbling, I can't hear a dimmin' thing you are saying. Endeavor spat out. I'm helping Tuya with his quirk. She finally looked at him in the eye and her heart plummeted to her stomach. He had that look in his eyes that she used to see on the news. He was looking for a fight, something mean and dirty. Usually those fights would end with extensive property damage and the villain ending up at a hospital or a morgue. No platitudes or reason would be able to calm him. The quirk is broken. You are truly stupid to even try. Nothing snappy came to mind, only the hammer of blood through her ears filled her head. You know what else is stupid? He walked closer and Izuku's heart was trying to leave her chest. I got a notification that you used my money to go to some all-night ice cream shop. The flames on his face flared with every word spat. Oh God, she had fed up. She could only hope that it was only her she had condemned. The tears started to fall even though everything else in her was frozen. He yelled more, but the words were all muffled in her fear. His voice came back into focus. Well, got anything to say? That was a trap. To say anything or nothing, there was no way out of this. A catch-22 wrapped around her throat. She muttered. He stood over her, looming. She should have expected the punch. It cracked against her nose and the whole side of her face. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. She must have bitten her tongue or the blood running from her nose gushed into her mouth, probably both. Stop muttering. Tuya was saying something but all Izuku's waning focus was on the man in front of her. Through the blood, she got out. Tuya, run. Endeavor pushed Izuku up against a wall by the neck, her head hitting the wood hard, making her see stars. The hand around her neck squeezed hard. Dangling there at his mercy, she tried to claw his hand away but his grip was tight. What do you have to say for yourself? There was no air left in her lungs to say anything. Her struggling got weaker as her vision got blurry from the tears and the slowly dwindling oxygen. In a flash of blue and yellow, she was dropped to the floor. She gulped and wheezed as she pushed herself onto her arms and her lungs filled once again. The taste of smoke was heavy in the air. Endeavor was unharmed and unburned. He was towering over Tuya, whose body was smoking from the burns from his own quirk. Defiant anger and the primal fear was written in Tuya's stance as he stood ready. Izuku's feet moved on their own. Endeavor got her in the chest, breaking something inside. He didn't become the number 4, 5 hero with weak arms. It was hard to breathe again, but she stood upright, something burning white-hot inside her. You were looking for a fight, well now you've got one. Leave him out of this. She felt Tuya's hands twisting in her shirt as she slowly backed them towards a wall. Endeavor sneered at her. Oh Izuku, don't worry, you're gonna get one. First Tuya's gonna learn to never use my quirk against me. So move and stop acting crazy. Oh Endeavor, you haven't seen me crazy yet? Izuku's smile was broken and bloody, lacking anything akin to All Might's. His frown deepened at her defiance. All she could do was raise her hands above her to try and stop him. But he didn't stop. There was no more clarity, only the burning pain and the small relief that this wasn't happening to Tuya. She fell to the ground on top of Tuya. Endeavor went for the kick, but she pushed both her and Tuya against a wall. Her shirt felt damp, but she couldn't tell if it was the blood from her head wound or Tuya's tears. Izuku bared her teeth like a cornered, wounded animal. Every breath was agony, but she spoke anyway. Get away from him. She couldn't yell no matter how much she wanted to. The bruising on her neck was already setting in. Her vision was still blurry, but she saw him winding up and then black. Slowly every sense came back again. She could wiggle her toes and feel the shooting pain in her chest, making it hard to breathe. To think of it, everything hurt, everything made it hard for her to breathe. Her eyes blinked, the soft light only making the pounding in her head worse. She could tell she was in the living room, laying face down on one of the expensive couches. Izuku hoped that her blood stained them. A foggy figure came into view, white hair and red-rimmed eyes framed by glasses. Fuyumi looked down at her and Izuku could distinctly feel iced hands soothing her wounds. Izuku! Fuyumi's voice broke. Are you okay? Her voice sounded small. Much too old for an elementary old kid. There were more pressing matters than herself. Where's Tuya? The words barely got out, the pain screaming at her to stop. She pushed it down. He's in the training hall. You've been out for a while. Tears strained to fall. Is Endeavor there too? Izuku let out a shuddered breath as she pushed herself up. One of her arms was definitely broken as well as a rib, that wasn't counting the harsh bruises and lacerations all over her, but those were problems for another time. Fuyumi shook her head. He went to bed. Izuku couldn't pinpoint how she felt, the only solid thing was the pain. All of a sudden Shudo came dashing into the room, not realizing how injured she was. He crashed into her in a desperate hug as he sobbed hard into her shoulder. But Izuku didn't care how much pain she was in, it didn't matter, couldn't matter. There was a painful hitch in her voice as she whispered soft, inaudible words to him. The broken rib on her other side screamed at her to let go, but she didn't listen and only held him closer to her chest with her one unbroken arm. Her skin looked paler than his in comparison. She wanted to hold him for longer, hold him harder, but there was a different place she needed to be. I'm gonna need you to let go. Izuku whispered, trying not to wince. I need to get to ya. Shudo shook his head into her shoulder. Sighing, she kissed the top of his head. She lifted her gaze to meet Fuyumi's and quickly, she understood. With a forceful pull, Fuyumi pulled Shudo off Izuku's side. He screamed and thrashed in Fuyumi's arms. Desperate tears fell hard onto the floor. Izuku bit her lip in spite of the pain stabbing at her heart and body. I know, sweetheart, but I need to make sure Tuya is all right. She wiped the tears away. Standing up was one of the hardest things she had to do, but she forced her legs to move. Squirming out of Fuyumi's hold, he wrapped himself around her leg. Again Fuyumi had to pry him off her. You can hold my hand, but we have to be fast. She offered her hand out to him. Now out of Fuyumi's grip, Shudo took it. With one last look at the room behind them, she shambled as quietly as she could out of the living room with the two children in tow. As quietly as she could, she limped out of the large living room with the two children in tow. Hand in hand, they tiptoed silently through the dead quiet house. Every bone hurt with each step. She was pretty sure she had a sprained ankle, but as Izuku pressed on, she had to. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping her sane and upright. The courtyard was washed in the pale moonlight and the soft hum of winter air. Once out on the snow-powdered yard, she broke out into a sprint. She didn't bother being quiet. The cold whipped her bare and stinging skin, but she paid it no mind, icy snow making her feet bleed. Shudo and Fuyumi could barely keep up. Natsuo was at those steel doors, pushing with all his might, and they wouldn't budge. He didn't even seem to notice them come up. She joined him, pushing with her good arm. The door creaked a little bit. Fuyumi and Shudo started to push as well. And the door creaked open a little wider, just enough for one person to slip through. Natsuo went in first. Izuku followed right behind him. So much noise came pouring out, Izuku had to resist putting her hands over her ears. The training hall was more of just a large room. Tuya was in the middle, engulfed in his own flames. They must have been pretty powerful because Natsuo had to hide behind Izuku as she shielded her eyes from his intense light. "Tuya!" She called out to him, but the roar of the flames and his screams seemed to have drowned her out. Natsuo clutched onto her shirt tightly as she turned to him. "I'm gonna need you to go get the first aid kit?" The boy nodded, not bothering to protest, and ran back outside where Fuyumi and Shudo watched on, protected behind the steel door. Izuku moved slowly toward him, hoping he would notice through his cries. There were no tears, they couldn't withstand such heat, and neither could Tuya. Her hands cut through the fire and carefully found the boy's face. Jolted away from his pain, Tuya's flames calmed to small embers. Big eyes met hers, and Izuku started to hum the calming song from earlier. A slow melody that brought more tears to Izuku's eyes. Those tears no longer steamed away from the heat. "Hey!" Izuku's voice was scratchy. "You're gonna be okay?" Tuya really started to cry now. Big fat tears fell down his steaming cheeks. Burns covered most of his body, blistered and raw on his skin. She couldn't imagine how much pain he was in. Seeing him like that made her knees weak and her feet couldn't keep her body up anymore. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed out, not from the pain. I should have fought harder. You didn't need to get into that. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." He didn't reply at first, only tried to get closer. "Why did you fight for me?" His hands wound in her shirt and slight smoke started to trail from them. "Oh, Tuya," she cooed at him as she ran a hand through his coarse hair. "I will never stop fighting for you, because it's the right thing to do. I'll fight harder next time." That last bit fell out without her permission. Deep down she knew there would be another scenario like this again. "But he'll take you away like he did with Mom." And she never fought back like that in the end. Why did she never fight back? Could Izuku survive over a decade with Endeavor and come out on the other side okay? She doubted it. She wanted to judge her. Why had she let this man do these terrible things to her own children? Yet Izuku couldn't hate her, not truly. She could only feel pity and a growing sense of déjà vu. "Just know that I love you, Tuya. Your mother does too." Tuya shook his head at the last part, and there was no way to show proof that his mother loved him, but that little picture Tuya had shown her, that kinda love in Rei's eyes, just doesn't go away. "She does, Tuya. You are a good kid. I love you too. Your siblings love you. But Dad never will." The burns and the hatred in Endeavor's eyes were proof. "And he's a fool, if he's a fool, because you are worth loving, Tuya." She did her best to cradle him with her one good arm as he sobbed in her lap, praying Natsuo had found the kit by now. Before she could clutch him closer, he started to violently cough, raking his whole body. It wasn't uncommon for him, he was genuinely a sickly kid. But as Izuku looked at her shirt where Tuya's head laid against her, the splatter of blood had her breath stop. Something was wrong. She didn't need her instincts to scream at her to tell her that much. "I'm taking you to the hospital." Endeavor for doing this to his own child. Endeavor. She knew that if she called an ambulance he'd be able to wave it away, citing there was nothing wrong. Who would argue with the number 4, no, 5 hero? She'd have to carry him with one broken arm and rib, not to mention a sprained ankle. Nothing but determination and fierce anger filled her as she stood up on shaky legs. He was too distressed to try and argue. With strength she didn't know she had, Izuku lifted him onto her back with her one arm. A sharp pain shot up every nerve, but she ignored it. Though Tuya was a skinny and small kid, her legs shook under the weight. Hold on tight. One foot in front of the other as she slowly went past the steel door. You guys just try and stay out of his way. I don't know how he'll react, but it will be bad. I'll be back. She walked a few footsteps into the snow and gave a look over her shoulder, half obscured by Tuya's white hair. I love you all. Natsuo finally came back with the first aid kit in hand, racing through the snow to meet them at the driveway. Change of plans, Natsuo. I'm taking him to the hospital, she said as she crossed the street. The pavement beneath her feet didn't pierce her feet like snow, but still SCKD whatever remaining heat she had. If it weren't for Tuya, warm on her back, she probably would have froze by then. Even then her quirk was working against her. The sound of his footsteps mixed with her own as she walked down the sidewalk. Where even was the hospital? God, why hasn't she planned anything? The inside of her brain had just told her to run, and she did stupidly into the winter night. It was a nice neighborhood, so it made sense no one was out this late at night. But one small figure was walking through the street lamps and the darkness. Hello, she called out, voice getting weaker. Hope blossomed, all warm inside. She hadn't noticed Natsuo's footsteps behind her stop. The figure got closer and it came into view. Izuku knew immediately who it was. Thank God for her intensive obsession to have known who All Might's personal doctor was. Only the die-hard fans knew that. The wave of relief that flooded her almost made her collapse. It was Recovery Girl in the flesh. Warm tears fell down her face. What were her chances? Please, you have to help him. He's hurt and dash, her frantic muttering was cut off by a wave of Recovery Girl's hand. What are you doing out here? I need to take Tuya to the hospital. He needs help. You need to use your quirk to heal him, Recovery Girl. You should be inside. She lectured. I can't be inside. Izuku was getting near hysterical. My husband did this. Tuya needs to go to the hospital. You need to heal him. I know he did this, he's the one who called me. She said it so offhanded that Izuku didn't know how to react. It wasn't just the winter that froze her at that moment. She took a step back. Running wasn't an option, even if Recovery Girl was an old lady, Izuku could barely stand as it was. Something shattered inside her, chewing a hole right through her gut. I won't tell Mr. Todoroki about your little jaunt here if you just go inside where I can heal you like I was paid to. She felt Natsuo's hand wind in the shirt at her side. What about Tuya? Izuku's voice is weak. I'm only supposed to heal him enough to keep him alive, she said so nonchalantly as she walked past Izuku back onto the property. Not even looking back to see if she followed. Because Izuku had to. There was no way out of this. The hospital was who knows how far, and Recovery Girl would have gotten Endeavor by the time Izuku got to the end of the block. Now come on, it's too late for this. I want to get this done so I can go back to bed. She couldn't cry anymore. Maybe her tear ducts were frozen solid at this point, or maybe she had no tears left to cry over heroes anymore. Her feet, all bloodied, followed Recovery Girl inside. Tuya's raspy breathing was the only thing filling her mind, too much in pain to even cry or realize what was going on around him. She can barely look at any of them in the eyes as she carries Tuya up the stairs and into his room. No one says anything. As careful as she could, Izuku laid him in his own bed. The room was so devoid of what a child's room should be, knickknacks, posters, signs of life, but she couldn't dwell on that right then. Is he gonna be alright? Natsuo asked, now Izuku's side. Big, fat tears almost obscured his eyes. Recovery Girl had brought her own supplies and started to unload them. I'm gonna look at Mrs. Todoroki first. She turned to Izuku. Just so you know, with my quirk you'll be out like a light, so I'll do your examination and healing in your room. I know how your FNG quirk works, Izuku snapped, somehow still standing mostly out of spite and Natsuo's hand that found hers. I'm not leaving him. And you better heal him first? Mrs. Todoroki, you're my main concern dash. I don't give a f how much he's paying you. Heal him first. You are clearly close to hypothermia, you have multiple broken dash. And whose fault is that? She screamed as loud as she could. Immediately she shut her mouth, realizing that Endeavor was asleep still. The seconds passed like molasses, and nothing came from a few doors down. Izuku let out a breath, but she didn't stop her icy glare at the hero. Fine, whatever. Recovery girl checked over Tuya and his burns. Wrapping them, she winced from time to time from touching an especially hot area. Izuku took sick pleasure in her pain. Izuku kept her eyes on him as if when she looked away he'd disappear. Finally, she finished and placed a kiss on the boy. His breaths evened in his sleep, and Izuku felt herself slump to the floor. The adrenaline that had been holding her up now vanished. The pain she had pushed away now came back in full force. It took everything in her to not pass out. Natsuo, ever the kind boy, lifted her head to put a pillow beneath her when she could barely move from the cold and the pain. Now let's get on to you, Mrs. Todoroki. Don't call me that. Izuku couldn't take it anymore. The name, the heroes, the pain. Too bad. Gruff as her voice, she set to work wrapping her injuries and setting her bones. You're a Todoroki? With the last of Izuku's injuries covered, Recovery Girl gave Izuku a wet kiss, and once again, Izuku's vision went black. Waking up this time around was a lot quicker, easier. Everything was sore, but there was no shooting pain that made her want to scream. Small victories. The events of the previous night came back to her at full force. She jolted upright, only wincing a little. She was still in Tuya's room, still on the floor. Light shone in and colored the walls in a deep yellow hue. It cut across her face and over the bed. The bed? Tuya. Immediately, she swiveled around and saw Tuya still asleep on his bed, bandaged up like a mummy. The only thing indicating he was alive was the shift of the blankets with every raspy breath he took. Izuku scrambled up to her feet, body weak and aching. She took Tuya in her hands and shook him with all she had. Tuya, can you hear me? The need to know if he was all right brought tears to her eyes, clouding everything else. Again and again, she shook his shoulders till he groaned out and Izuku let go. She had hurt him. Oh God, she had hurt him even more. His eyes blinked open. A scowl grew on his face and with a scratchy voice, "You scared the shit out of me. What are you doing? Let me sleep." He closed his shut hard, to further drive his point home. She could tell he winced as he brought the covers over his head to block her out like it had been any other day. The sound Izuku let out was between a sob and a laugh. Relief coursed through her, dulling everything else. She wiped her eyes with the ends of her sleeves, only to realize just how bloody they were. Rolling up her bloody sleeves felt surreal, like she was in a dream. But this was all real. The smell of blood was almost too much for her famished stomach to take. Before she could even think of changing out of her bloodied, half-burnt clothes, Natsuo came into the room with a bowl of food and almost dropped it at the sight of her upright. "Izuku, you're awake." He ran up to her almost like he was coming in for a hug, but thought better of it when the bowl in his hands got in the way. So instead he offered her the bowl. She took it, if not hesitantly, confusion written on her face. Natsuo caught on and lifted his hand to explain. "Fuyumi made a whole bunch for when you guys wake up. It's already dinner. I was just gonna come up here and to keep you guys company, even though you guys were asleep." Fuyumi was so angry, saying that I was gonna spill the food she made all over Tuya's room, which I'm not. "This one's for you. I'm gonna get more." If Fuyumi was cooking and Natsuo was his usual energetic self, it must mean that things were relatively okay. Thank Dash, the boy is out the door before she can finish her sentence. Smelling the food was almost enough to knock her off her feet. The hunger hit her full force, and by the time Natsuo had come back into Tuya's room, Izuku had downed the whole thing. Fuyumi and Shudo were right behind him, with trays, plenty of napkins, and their own bowls. Fuyumi was fussing over Shudo's ability to handle such a large load, but in his defiance he insisted he could, his little arms holding all they could. "Is Tuya awake?" Natsuo asked as he put down the two bowls in his hands. He tried not to look at the bandages covering Tuya. Sadly, he rasped out, sarcastic and dry as ever. At least it made Natsuo smile. Izuku grabbed the extra bowl that Natsuo had set aside and a pair of chopsticks. Bending over made her wince, but she grit her teeth and stood back up. "Do you think you can sit up for me?" Tuya let out a grunt of what was meant to be a yes. Natsuo tried to help him, but he snapped at him the second he tried. Slowly but surely he sat up on his own, like it was the most important thing he could do at that moment. And maybe it was, to him at least. You're gonna need to eat. Can you lift your arms? Izuku pretty much knew the answer already, but she asked anyway. Tuya just needed to know he was in control, what little control he still had. What she could give him. Izuku watched him try, but his arms barely got up to his waist. Izuku had to hold down a tear or two, even if she did want to fall apart right there and then. For a lot of different reasons. But 4 pairs of eyes were on her, for children. That didn't need to see any more blood or tears than they already had. Izuku took a deep breath, pulling herself together increment by increment. That's okay. I'll just feed you then. Behind the bandages, she saw him scowl. He shook his head while rolling his eyes but didn't say anything. Izuku pushed, just open your mouth. No dashed, he was cut off by Izuku quickly shoveling a heaping mound of rice into his mouth. An angry glare was all he did as he chewed his food. You need to eat? She repeated, a little stronger, less sympathetic. He couldn't help but mock her. You need, and once again Izuku shoved more food into his mouth. Swallowing hard, he continued, cheater dash, and Izuku got a whole piece of pork in this time. She hated to admit it, but his pouty face, although hidden, was helping her in margins. You know that phrase, fool me once, Izuku goaded, hoping that he'd retort again. All he did was grumble as he chewed, learning his lesson. He didn't hold eye contact long, just a quick glare at her, and his eyes stayed on his burnt hands the rest of the meal. In the end, he did at least eat half his food. Izuku wanted to just shove the whole thing down his throat. He was too small, too hurt, too skinny, he needed nutrients. But she'd fight that battle a different day. Today, tomorrow and the days after, she will make sure Tuya grows up happy and healthy, no matter Endeavor's influence and pain. She gathered up the dishes, and at the same time corralled Shudo to leave the room. He was too hyped up to do anything but run around. Fuyumi took the bulk of them as Izuku's hand began to shake from their weight. Come on guys, you've got school tomorrow. Except for Tuya, he could barely walk to the bathroom, so obviously he had to stay home. And she would stay with him. I'm staying too, Natsuo declared as he got onto his feet. A fierce look in his eye told her he wasn't going to back down. Izuku bit her lip, ready to shoot him down the best way she knew how, but then remembered how close the 2 brothers were. Out of all of his siblings, Natsuo was the closest to Tuya. Natsuo was his shadow, his rock, being his brother with gentle teasing and hearty laughs, giving Tuya the normalcy he needed. Now that was not to say that Tuya wasn't close to the rest of them, but Fuyumi had the emotional resilience to carry on and Shudo was ignorant to truly the extent of it all. She pinched her chin, thinking hard. What could it hurt, right? So she caved. Okay, but only for today. He probably needed this too anyway. If it did him some good, that's all that Izuku cared about at the end of the day. Natsuo nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. She'd practically hammered home how important school was every time she saw them working on homework. It was one of the things she praised the most. So the next day only Fuyumi and Shudo went to school, and Izuku and Nasu headed up to Tuya's room with his breakfast, leftovers from earlier. Normally at this time, she'd be cleaning or doing other various chores, but Tuya took precedent over all that. Natsuo had something behind his back that he refused to show her but insisted that it would be awesome. Tuya ate a little better than he had yesterday. Izuku still had to feed him, though he could move his arms quite a bit higher than he had used to. In a sing-song voice Natsuo asked, "Guess what I have, Tuya?" When Tuya didn't reply, Natsuo continued undeterred. In one swift movement, he flipped it out for Tuya to see. A book? He tilted the book left and right, showing it off, unable to conceal his enthusiasm. Since you can't get out of bed, I thought you could use a good distraction. Izuku, can you read it out loud for us? Pretty please? Izuku smiled, a tired smile, but a smile no less. Of course. Natsuo beamed. Scoot over. He pushed the air, motioning Tuya over so he could sit beside him. Tuya did, grumbling because that's what he's best at. Izuku did as well, but without the dramatics. A book would do Tuya some good. Without missing a beat, Natsuo began riddling off about the book, so here's the story. This is the first book in the series, Warrior Cats. He raised his hands in front of him, brandishing them like they were claws. Before Tuya could stare back at him with an unimpressed look, he passed the book to Izuku with an earnest gaze. Tuya rolled his eyes. That book is for babies. Is not. Is too. But look, there are battles and dying and all that. Natsuo pointed at the cover. So please, for me, can we read this book? He was really pulling out the big guns, hands clasped like a prayer and staring at Tuya with the puppy dog look. I know you'll love it. Tuya looked away, an attempt at a scowl. Ugh, fine. I'm probably not gonna be interested anyway. With a big smile, Natsuo gave Izuku the book. So with both boys settled at her sides, she began. Time passed by quicker than she'd meant it to. She hadn't noticed how many hours she had spent reading till she felt her throat dry and she checked her phone to see it was about midday. How about I make some lunch? She said after turning the page to the next chapter. A good place as any to stop. Tuya nodded into her shoulder, eager half-lidded eyes read the words of the new chapter before she closed it, and he said he wasn't interested. At least his appetite this morning was better than it had been yesterday. But still, she would stick with foods she knew wouldn't upset his stomach. Okay, a yawn from Natsuo. Can we read more after? Of course. That time she heard a little of her mom in her own voice. It startled her, but she didn't have the time to ruminate over it. Untangling herself from the blanket was a time-consuming affair, trying to move just so not to disturb Tuya's wounds, and Natsuo wasn't making it any easier by just lying there. But soon enough she stood upright and was reminded of her hurt ankle, of the soreness of her previously broken body, though she didn't react and simply carried on down to the kitchen. She didn't have the luxury of thinking of that nightmare either. When she came back upstairs with something quick she had whipped up, there was no noise coming from Tuya's room. With full hands, Izuku gently slid the door open with her foot and found that they both had fallen asleep. The book laid between them. Natsuo hogged most of the bed with Tuya scrunched up at his side. This was the most peaceful Izuku had ever seen Tuya, his face not holding any of the pain he had. And that mere thought made her smile, and she closed the door behind her. Natsuo had woken up a bit later and had all but demanded that they finish the book. Izuku wasn't gonna say no. So they had finished the first book by the time Fuyumi and Shudo got home that day. Ever the good sister, Fuyumi had gotten both Natsuo's and Tuya's homework for them, and had brought Shudo home by herself as well. And as much as Tuya ummed about the homework, he seemed to find a little joy in the fact that she had gone out of her way for him. But the papers were given with avoiding eyes. You know, you still need to make it up to her. Izuku handed him a stilted tray for him to work on while in bed. Pencil laid there by Natsuo, who was doing his work on the floor. He was pretty studious and got to work on his own math homework right away. His eyes scanned the math homework, which Izuku doubted he was absorbing. I have something in mind, okay? Don't worry about it. He bit out the last part, and with a shaky hand brought the pencil to the page. Izuku hummed in response. Do you need some help with the math? By the way the pencil was smoking, she could already guess his answer. Yeah. That next morning, Natsuo actually got ready for school with little protest. Though she suspected that it was because that meant he could get the next book in the series for Tuya. As Natsuo and Fuyumi put on their coats and backpacks, Shudo had left something in his room, so he raced up the stairs to get it. With this opportunity, Izuku bent down to their level, which wasn't that far down since she was pretty short. Okay guys, since your geography B night didn't end very well, I've decided that you both get to choose one thing we get to do on a weekend. It's your day, your choice. Without hesitation, Natsuo answered first. Go-karts. It has to be free. Izuku didn't want to think about the what-if when it came to frivolous spending again. Even if it wasn't All Might related. Go-karts did sound fun though. She hoped one day she'd be able to take him. Ugh, then I'll have to think then, he groaned out. With a long, loud Natsuo mimicked Fuyumi, who had put a finger to her chin in thought. It's okay, you don't have to tell me now, Izuku said as she straightened back up. Fuyumi raised her hand. Does pierced ears count as free? I still have some of my mom's jewelry, so all I need is a poker. That could probably be done. For thousands of years, people have been piercing their ears and with little more than a good stab. Yup, I think I can do that. I'll just have to Google it or watch a YouTube video first though. Yeah. Fuyumi did a quick air pump, before schooling her expression a bit. Yes. Thank you Izuku, that sounds great. Izuku smiled. I'll get that all set up for this weekend. Now, off you guys go. And can you get Tuya's homework again? Fuyumi nodded, ready to go. Shudo ran back down, slipped on his light-up shoes, and grabbed Fuyumi's hand. Thank you, Izuku said, and the door closed behind them. It was about time to change Tuya's bandages. As much as she didn't want to wake him, they really needed to be changed. The mere thought of his wounds getting infected almost put her in a tailspin, but she couldn't break down. She needed to help him. With a soft knock on his door, she could hear him groan awake. Slowly, she slid the door open. Light filtered through the slits in the shades. Glowing streaks showed the outline of the room in a soft yellow. Don't turn on the lights, he snapped, but let out a breath. Please. Okay, I need to change your bandages though. Natsuo's pencils and one of Shudo's toys laid on the floor as she tiptoed around them. Tuya didn't look at her, he just stared at the ceiling with his bright blue eyes. He didn't say anything as she walked over to his bed and knelt down. The hard floor hurt her knees, but she paid it no mind. She'd be their hero, take any pain. In such a short amount of time she had gotten so attached to these kids. She'd be there for them, since no one else would. With gentle hands, she unraveled the used bandages, soiled and bloodied still. He hissed through clenched teeth, but his face didn't change from his normal scowl. Wince after wince, and she flinched with him. They were finally all off. On that night, did you really mean what you said? He whispered, his gaze stayed on the ceiling. Every word, she replied with force. Even that you loved me? His voice was so soft she could barely hear him. Till the day I die, a certain, unchangeable truth, and she said it with the conviction to match that. They didn't say anything for a long time as Izuku kept back her tears at the burns that marred his skin, reminding her how she failed him. She may have been forced to come here, to be some beach for a hero, but she chose to love these kids, to love Tuya. It was her choice and she would never back down from it. Finally, she gathered her courage, she started to wrap him back up. Do you really think my mom loves me too? He asked with tears welling up in his eyes, still staring up at the ceiling. That question surprised her, but Izuku quickly answered, yes, moms with that look in their eyes in the photo don't stop loving. I don't know much about what happened, but she was sick and it's hard to see clearly when that happens. My mom was sick too, in a different way than your mom. Izuku paused, remembering. She had a brain tumor. Sometimes it was hard for her to understand that she loved me. And she still loved you. Yes, every day. More silence passed between them. His breathing hadn't been the same since that day, and even now as he heals, every breath seemed like a struggle. It twisted the knife in her bleeding heart. But why would my mom even love me in the first place? A single tear fell down his cheek, but he didn't seem to notice. His gaze was focused on a faraway memory. Because, I'll say this till you believe it. You are worth loving to. Tuya was silent the rest of the time as she wrapped his body. When she had finished, the light had shifted somewhat. Tuya needed to eat and probably take some pain meds as well. Izuku stood up and pushed his fully white hair out of his face, kissing his forehead. I love you, Tuya. It looked like he needed to hear it. And she would say it over and over till he understood. Tuya didn't say anything. His eyes were closed, but he seemed calm. Calm as he could be. Just by the expression on his face, Izuku could tell he was processing a lot. That was okay with her. She smiled, soft and genuine. I'm gonna get you some breakfast. She left the room, feeling a different air to it than before. She hoped that was a good sign. As the days went by, Tuya could move more and more, and as she changed his bandages over and over, she could see the healing. He had been healed somewhat by Recovery Girl, just enough so it wouldn't scar, but now it was really looking better. He might even be able to go to school next week. Some of those days he wanted to be alone, and she respected that, but other days he gently pulled on her shirt, and so she stayed. She'd carved her fingers through his hair, muttering about quirks or anything really that came to her mind. He didn't say much, only closing his eyes. And every day Endeavor didn't come back, probably chasing the spot he had lost. Now, Izuku couldn't even feel the satisfaction that someone was above him without the urge to hyperventilate. She could only hope and pray that this failure would keep him far away. But on a lighter note, the weekend brought Fuyumi's day. Izuku was going to make it as special as she could. In a drawer, there had been some nail polish. Honestly, Izuku didn't know if it would be special, but she hoped that Fuyumi liked it anyway. As the weekend started and breakfast was eaten, Fuyumi had been practically bouncing in her seat as she put away her dishes. "You ready?" Izuku asked. Fuyumi vehemently nodded. "I have the earrings and my mom's stuff. Let me go get them." "Great. Also, I have a special surprise in my room too." "Wait just a second," she called after her as she raced up the stairs in front of her. When they met in Izuku's room, a huge box of stuff was carried in Fuyumi's arms. Fuyumi set it down on the floor and brought out a jewelry box. Reverently, she gently opened it. It was an antique if she ever saw one, yet it was in such good condition. "Do you want to do nails first or earrings first?" Izuku asked. "Nails? Yeah, I found some nail polish." Izuku brought out the colors and placed them on the floor for Fuyumi to look at. Her mouth made an O shape as she looked over all the different shades. She was quiet a while, tapping her chin in serious thought. Eventually, she pointed at the bottles. "Nails?" Izuku grinned. "Great. Which color?" Fuyumi mulled it over like it was the most important question she'd ever been asked. "Pink," she decided, giving Izuku her hand. "It's my favorite." "Perfect choice," she said with a wink. They idly talked as she finished both her hands and feet. And Fuyumi insisted on painting Izuku's nails as well, so Izuku chose the same color so they'd match. As they dried, and they used Fuyumi's quirk to help with that, a quiet rap on her door cut them off from their conversion. "Come in." Tuya poked his head in and stiffly came in, closing the door behind him. Most of his bandages were off at this point, though some still clung to his arms. He had a look on his face. A nervous sort of look that he was trying to mask with something between annoyed and neutral. It wasn't working. "I'm sorry for burning your hair, okay? Just take these earrings." And whatever, he opened his hand to give them to Fuyumi, who took them hesitantly in her cupped hands. "You made these?" The stones caught the artificial light just right and pink shimmered in her palm. Her fingers traced their outlines as if making sure they were real. "Yeah, out of pins and some rocks I found. I welded them together with my quirk and glue." Tuya's arms were folded across his chest more carefully than he wanted to appear. His eyes flickered to different parts of the room and back to Fuyumi's eyes. For a tense moment, Izuku didn't know how she would react. But a second later, she burst into tears, all messy with snot coming down her face. A smile nonetheless. His hands gripped his arms. "Hey, stop crying. It's okay if you don't like them." "I didn't mean to make her cry, Izuku," he said, as if he was a defendant on trial. "She only cried harder." "Okay, I'm gonna go. I'm sorry for making you cry." Stepping back, he was clearly uncomfortable, but he couldn't escape and Fuyumi brought him into a bear hug. Her grip brought him to his knees and onto her level. "I love them. I'm gonna put these in my ears instead." "I'm glad," he let himself smile, but he quickly schooled his face. "But can you get off? I can't breathe." A giggle, then she nodded and released him from her hold. "Thank you," she paused, seeming to think over what to say next. "And I'm sorry for inviting Dad. Never mind, it doesn't matter. I'm just sorry." Tuya couldn't meet her eyes, but in a quiet voice, he said, "Thanks." A stretch of silence followed. Izuku didn't dare say anything. This was between them. Fuyumi finally spoke up, giving him a crooked smile. "Do you maybe want to paint nails with us?" By the look on his face as he brought his eyes up, Izuku could tell that he desperately wanted to, but was silent for a bit as if he was actually debating it. "Yeah, sure. Whatever," he sighed, all dramatic. And Izuku couldn't help but snort at his theatrics. "But first let's do the earrings since Tuya made you such nice ones," Izuku said, getting all the supplies that were needed into order in front of her. Surprisingly, that went quite well. Each ear was poked and Izuku followed the YouTube instructions exactly. Tuya even held her hand as she winced as each earring was placed. No more tears were shed. The small makeup mirror that Rei had was used to show Fuyumi her new look. Back and forth she went, from ear to ear, staring at the little studs. She smiled to herself, seemingly satisfied, clicking the mirror shut. "They're really cute." Both Tuya and Izuku smiled with her. Izuku asked, "Which color do you want, Tuya?" all the colors laid on the towel in front of her. Immediately he said, "Black?" Of course he did. "Can I do one hand?" Fuyumi tentatively asked. With a nod from Tuya, both she and Izuku got to work. It took a couple of weeks, but Natsuo finally did decide what he wanted to do for his day. He wanted to go to a nature reserve. Though Izuku did think some of that decision was based on that he wanted to be like the cats in the book and run free through the forest. So they all piled onto a train to the nearest national park early in the morning. It was only an hour away, but she packed snacks and other things they might need. And from both Tuya's and Natsuo's insistence, that included one of the books. "I'm just reading it because Natsuo wants to. And since he's a baby, I have to be the one to read it out loud," he insisted as he pulled out the book. "I'm not a baby." Natsuo waved his arms, almost knocking both Fuyumi and Shuto in the head. They had been able to get out of the way in time. "I can read a lot of words." Chuckling, Izuku shook her head. "I know you can read. You're just a big baby." His cheeks puffed out as he tried to tackle both Izuku and Tuya to not much success. Both she and Tuya laughed, and that only fueled him to try harder, which he had more success this go-around since he was a giant for his age. "Midoriya," an unfamiliar voice said from further down the train. Izuku froze, as did Tuya after noticing Izuku did so. Natsuo still was trying to tackle them both out of their seats. "Izuku Midoriya?" the voice said again, and Izuku finally turned to see who was talking to her. It took Izuku a moment to recognize her. She had cut her dark hair and she wasn't wearing the school uniform. Izuku's steady voice almost faltered as she replied. "Hi Ito." Ito smiled. She had always been pleasant and a reliable work partner, though nothing more than that. "It's good to see you, Midoriya." With gentle, shaky hands she pushed Natsuo back to his seat. "Natsuo, settle down please," she had said, and he stopped, looking between Ito and her, confused. "It's good to see you too." Izuku's reply shook at the end. Ito sat across from them, folding her legs as she settled in. "So, what school did you end up transferring to?" She was making idle conversation. So why did she feel like Izuku was about to collapse from sheer stress? "I go to school online now," she stuttered out. People say repetition was what made someone good at anything, but here she was lying half her life and she hadn't got any better, it had only gotten easier to do. "That's nice. Did you do it that way so you could nanny more?" A pause. "That's what these kids are, right? I'm sorry for assuming or anything." "It's okay." Izuku tried to give her the best smile she could. Yeah, that's definitely the reason. Midoriya, always on that grind. Since you aren't there to hold the first place spot, Sato is now the best in the class. Though she's mad that she got it by default." Izuku nervously laughed. That does sound like her. It had been so long since she had been to school, let alone thought about Sato. She hadn't realized how much she missed this, even Sato and her mean frown, the idle talk about school, about people she knew, all without the thought of anything in her life now. Ito had always loved to talk, a blabbermouth some would say. She would share gossip and tidbits of the other kids in class with Izuku even though they weren't friends. Izuku had always listened intently, the subtle loneliness and curiosity making her hoard this information closely. Even though Izuku herself had no one else to share it with. And as Ito continued to talk about their former shared classmates, teachers, what disasters had happened in Izuku's absence. Izuku was transfixed, leaning in closer as if over the quiet hum of the train would prevent her from hearing the details of Mr. Okamoto's latest test that even Sato had failed. "This is our stop." Jolting, as if electrified, Izuku turned to the children sitting next to her. Fuyumi had stood up at this point, gathering Shuto from his seat. "This is our stop," Fuyumi repeated, looking between Izuku and Ito. With all her and the kids' things in her arms, Izuku replied, "Yes, of course, thanks Fuyumi." Ito, with a wave, had smiled at all the Todorokis. "It was good to see you, Midoriya." The train doors opened and with one last look behind her, Ito was gone as the doors closed back up. "What's a nanny?" Shuto asked as he grabbed her hand to cross the street, swinging it back and forth. "A person hired to take care of kids." "I thought you were a stepmom." A pause. "Did you lie?" She didn't want to reply, but he deserved to have his questions answered. "I am your stepmom, not a nanny, and I did lie." "Why?" His big mismatched eyes looked up at her for all the answers in the world. I don't know, that was the closest thing to the truth she could say out loud. And they crossed the street. It shouldn't have shocked Fuyumi that in a more perfect world, Izuku wouldn't be here with them. She'd be with Ito talking about tests and high school stuff. Maybe even riding that same train, only going far away from them. Instead, here Izuku was, with a crooked nose and only the dream of going back to school. Still, it struck her as she watched them talk, that Izuku just had not magically appeared one day like Mary Poppins. She had a life before all this and maybe she could have one without them. And she could be gone just as quickly as she appeared. Fuyumi loved Izuku, like a mother or like a sister, she couldn't tell but a mix of both that ebbed and flowed every day. Izuku had inserted herself into her life and her brother's lives, into the family Fuyumi always wanted, and their Fuyumi wanted her to firmly stay, however selfish that made her. As they walked off the platform and followed the map to the preserve, Fuyumi walked closer to Izuku and mulled over these new thoughts. Along the way, barely even noticing that she had slowed as they entered the park, her brothers had run off ahead onto the snow-covered trail into the forest. Fuyumi? She hadn't noticed she had stopped, and now she looked up. There Izuku stood a couple of paces ahead, looking back at her, waiting. Fuyumi didn't reply. You okay? She tilted her head, light concern touched her face. At that question, Fuyumi went over and wrapped her arms around Izuku, who made a surprised noise but didn't pull away. A second later, Izuku's arms wrapped around her, keeping her close. Hey, are you okay? She repeated and pushed the bangs out of Fuyumi's face. Don't you want to outrun or something with your brothers? I'm okay. Fuyumi buried her face into Izuku's jacket. Glasses caught in the fabric, but she didn't care. Without even seeing her, Fuyumi could tell she was wearing a smile as she spoke. Let's get moving, get our blood pumping. It's too cold to be standing around like this. Fuyumi didn't know why but she giggled but she did. I don't need to get my blood pumping. Part of my quirk is that I'm resistant to the cold. Izuku stiffened immediately, making Fuyumi look up at her in confusion. She was deathly pale, fear-filled eyes watched Fuyumi intently. Fully resistant? I don't know. I think so. She had never fully tested it but she had never felt any cold. Had she made her upset somehow? Izuku was biting her lip and her eyes were wet with unshed tears. Fuyumi tried to pull away. She had definitely done something wrong, but Izuku's strong arms pulled her closer. Are you okay? Did I do something wrong? The question seemed to have snapped Izuku out of her thoughts. No, you didn't do anything wrong. I'll explain later. When you're older. You did nothing wrong, so need to worry. She quickly wiped the tears. They started to walk back down the trail, side by side, one arm still around Fuyumi's shoulders protectively. The snow underfoot crunched under their footsteps. The only other sound besides them was her brother's voices far up ahead. Is it because of my quirk? Is there something wrong with being resistant? I mean you are resistant to fire, so those words toppled off her tongue, but she snapped her mouth shut. Fuyumi couldn't look her in the eye. In Izuku's exact words, she had said she'd explain later, and here Fuyumi was pushing her. Izuku's arms squeezed her a little harder. I just can't let you end up like me, she whispered as if telling a secret. What do you mean? I want to be just like you. Izuku stopped dead in her tracks and turned to face Fuyumi. The expression on her face was one Fuyumi couldn't read. No, she shook her head, now with both gloved hands on Fuyumi's shoulders as if to steady herself. You are going to be so much more. Fuyumi kept her mouth shut this time, even though she wanted to question what she meant. Let's go catch up, okay? With a fake smile, she dropped her hands to her side. They walked in silence till her brothers' voices came back from barely muffled whispers to their usual loud crescendos. After they came to the bend in the trail, Tuya and Shudo came into view. As they got closer, Fuyumi saw what Shudo was doing. He was, one by one, stuffing his mouth full of rocks that made the path. Shudo, don't put rocks in your mouth. Izuku squeaked, racing over to him. He started to shovel them into his mouth faster. Spit them out, she said as she knelt next to him and put her hands on both cheeks. And one by one, they fell onto the melting, patchy, snow. Don't eat rocks, Shudo. Shudo nodded his head. I'm gonna need you to say it. I won't eat any more rocks. Izuku turned to the eldest Todoroki. Tuya, why didn't you do anything? He shrugged. I wanted to see what would happen. He could have choked. She pulled Shuto up on her hip, slightly swaying as she told Shuto, open your mouth, which he did. He didn't though. The sleeve of her jacket went past her hands and she used it to wipe his dirty tongue, which Shuto mildly protested at, but he couldn't do too much while being held. As the oldest, you gotta set an example. Shuto looks up to you, so tell him no. Or at least try and stop him. His voice was taut, his fist balled at his sides. I don't owe Shuto anything. Finally looking at Tuya, Izuku held on to Shuto a little harder. You're right, no one owes anyone anything, but here we are doing things for each other. Wanna know why? Because it's the right thing to do. Tuya put on a scowl, defiant, nobody does jack. So why should I? You always say it because it's the right thing to do, he mocked. So what? So if what? The right thing doesn't exist. Fuyumi wanted to intervene, to speak up, but she couldn't move and her lips sealed shut. The world is unfair, Tuya, but don't be unfair back. Show Shuto the kindness you want yourself. Tuya just stared back, the anger plain as day on his face. Whatever. Izuku didn't say anything else, only slightly bouncing Shuto on her hip. Tension thick, it made it hard for Fuyumi to breathe. The brush parted, revealing Natsuo as he crashed right through. Guess what I got, guys? Barreling toward them, he must have sensed the tension because he stopped and looked between Izuku and Tuya. Izuku was the first to break off their little stare down. I don't know, what do you get? She gave him an encouraging smile. His excitement came back at full force. This, proudly he extended a handful of green grass. This grass? Tuya deadpanned. It's green grass. Natsuo corrected, shoving it in Tuya's face. He promptly smacked it away. That didn't faze Natsuo though. You know what that means? That you're weird? Tuya rolled his eyes. As a response, Natsuo stuck out his tongue. Fuyumi raised her hand. It's getting warmer? Well yeah, but more specifically it's gonna be spring soon. Spring, Izuku repeated as if the word was foreign on her tongue. Yeah. Spring, honestly the best season ever. Everything changes, Natsuo said as he brought it for the rest of them to see this sign. No more snow. I like spring too, said Izuku, taking a blade of brilliant green grass and holding it closer to her face, studying it. Then she gave it Shuto to look at. He shoved it into his mouth without a second thought. Shuto! Izuku exclaimed, but it was too late, he had already swallowed it. Natsuo and Tuya started to laugh, and Fuyumi couldn't help but join in. Spring did come, and it came in hard and swift. Getting up early had never been an easy mountain Mitsuki could climb, let alone drag her kid up as well. But that didn't change the fact she had to get up even earlier because someone had fed up at the office and Mitsuki had to go in an hour early to fix the mess. Masaru was going in even earlier, but Mitsuki had drawn the short straw and had the impossible task of getting Katsuki to school, and now even earlier than normal. After much yelling and explosions, Mitsuki had her kid in the car with minimal property damage and on schedule. She counted that as a win. Katsuki, as always, ran inside, and this time Mitsuki had to follow. Stupid kid, getting into some trouble and the teacher making her come in and talk about it. Another wrench in her day. It was a little early, long before the bell, as she climbed up the stairs after Katsuki, telling him to slow down, which he didn't as he bolted into his classroom. Mitsuki was about to go after him, but a familiar figure walked by in the corner of her eye. The green hair and big eyes, dead giveaways to the identity of who this person was. Izuku! Mitsuki couldn't believe it, even after all these years she still looked so much like Inko. Her hair was even tied up like hers. Oh, had she missed her, after Inko's funeral was the last time she had seen her, with her hair pinned up and her small hands wrung in her lap. A big scarf covered half her face, buried deep within the fabric. It wasn't winter anymore, but she remembered that her quirk left her dangerously susceptible to the cold. Even without the scarf blocking the way, she could tell she was shocked and maybe a little afraid as they stared at each other. It was most definitely her, those freckles could be no one else. It's me, Mitsuki. Did she not remember her mother's best friend? To be honest, it stung if that were true. As nervous and high-strung as Izuku was as a child, she began to wave her hands and her eyes got even bigger. "Of course I remember you, Auntie. I just was," a pause. "Surprised, that's all. So what brings you here? Are you doing something for school?" She couldn't be more than 17 now, well into high school. Maybe she was trying to be a teacher, doing some shadowing. It was the middle of the day during school hours. Izuku would make a good teacher, so ever patient and kind. Something dark passed through Izuku's features, and before she can answer, a child with a burned scar over his eye and dual-colored hair came running towards her and crashed into her legs. The boy let out soft sobs that could barely be made out, but the words that kept repeating were, "All might and book." With a practiced motion, Izuku picked him up and he immediately quieted. He buried his face in between the scarf to a point where she couldn't see his head anymore. Whispered words of reassurance were spoken, but Mitsuki couldn't hear them. Izuku's hand rubbed his back in small circles as the child held on tight, still crying. "But Izuku," the kid whined. That was oddly personal to call someone who was a teacher. Maybe she was a nanny. Mitsuki felt a little bad that she hadn't remembered Izuku's real age. She must be 18 or 19 at least then if she wasn't in school. While she was a terrible best friend if she had forgotten Izuku's age, the book was gone. He was trying to wiggle even closer as if to meld onto her. "Someone else is probably reading it." She pressed a kiss to the top of his head. "You'll just have to wait your turn like with Natsuo yesterday." Another personal first name. He didn't reply, but he leaned into the affection as she placed her head against his and murmured something Mitsuki couldn't make out. It seemed too much of a private and NTMT moment for Mitsuki to be watching in on. One of the kindergarten teachers, not Katsuki's, came bounding out of the classroom frazzled, but she calmed at the sight of the kid in Izuku's arms. "Todoroki, you know better than to run off like that." The boy held on tighter around her neck if that was possible. Izuku esiki in a breath but didn't say anything. "You know I'll have to put you down," Izuku murmured. "You gotta go to school?" Todoroki shook his head furiously. "I'll be back after like always." She gave another quick kiss on the top of his head. "I promise." Slowly, Izuku was able to pry his fingers off and set him down. She knelt to his level and fished something out of her briefs pocket as he still clung to one of her arms. "Here." She placed something yellow into one of his hands. "Can you take care of All Might for me for today?" The child nodded fractionally and Izuku smiled all the way to her eyes. With gentle hands, she wiped his drying tears. "Okay, I have to go now. I'll see you soon," she said as she got up, hands still on the boy's face. "I love you." Mitsuki was flabbergasted through this whole scene, struck silent. Before she could even dream of processing and reacting to whatever she just saw, Katsuki came bounding out of his classroom with his little hands on his hips. "Mom, what are you doing here?" He pouted hard. "Stop being embarrassing and go away." "I'm here because you couldn't behave, you gremlin." Mitsuki rolled her eyes and put her hands on her hips, mirroring him. "Go back to your classroom, if I'm so embarrassing then." He huffed and stomped back inside. Chuckling, Mitsuki turned back to see Izuku was gone, like a ghost. As if she wasn't there at all, and Mitsuki had to check her memory to make sure she was real. She tried not to feel hurt that she had left so suddenly. "So what's with her?" she asked Todoroki's teacher, to really make sure that happened. "Is she the nanny or something?" "Oh, that's Mrs. Todoroki, his stepmom." "Stepmom?" she screamed. Izuku hid in the bathroom. Kinda felt like high school all over again, right down to the panic attack on the toilet. She normally didn't actually go into the school, but Shudo had given her a picture to hold onto that morning so he could give it to his teacher, a colorful crayon drawing of All Might. Forgetting she had it, she had almost left without giving it to him. And in the end, she hadn't even gotten it to him. She had paid dearly for that little mistake. Since Mitsuki's kid was in a different class, Izuku had stupidly thought they would never have to cross paths. Her hyperventilating slowly calmed to harsh, shallow breaths. As she wiped the tears with the end of her scarf, she checked her phone. It read that she had been in the bathroom for at least an hour. It seemed like that would be enough time where Izuku would be able to leave, without having to run into her again. Once out of the bathroom, she looked around just to make sure and went out the side door. Though she doubted she was allowed to use that door. Her legs guided her back as her mind wandered, not able to focus on anything. Dinner needed to be made, and when she got back, all the ingredients of a dish were laid out in front of her. Her hands, thankful for the distraction, set to work starting on the vegetables. Izuku focused solely on the carrots in front of her, chopping them into little pieces. Maybe that's why she didn't hear him come in. "Izuku," he stated. "Mr. Todoroki?" she gasped, clutching her shirt in one hand and the knife in the other. You startled me." He usually was never home this early and lately never home at all. But Izuku's luck had seemed to run out once again. Without warning, he backed her against the wall, hands heavy. Izuku already knew what was coming, but her body still shook like a leaf in the wind. He was so much bigger than her, a fact that will never change. The smell of him consumed every sense, harsh smoke, choking her without his hands on her neck. Sloppy kisses tried to open her mouth, but she couldn't move. Pinned there, she could hear his breathing deep and raspy, like he had smoked cigarettes in a past life. Her eyes were squeezed shut like every other time this happened. All she could think about was the knife that was sitting on the cutting board a few feet away. Somehow that was a calming thought, though she knew she could never do it. His hands roamed a little farther and Izuku bit her lip to keep from crying. A knock at the door was her savior. Endeavor's grip loosened and Izuku used that opportunity to wiggle away. "I'll get that," she assured him, and he surprisingly let her go with a huff of annoyance. She took deliberately slow steps to the door, as if that would make her composed and presentable by the time she got there. All her unshed tears were wiped before she got to the door. Izuku didn't even bother checking the peephole. They lived in a gated community, so whoever was knocking had a good reason to be there. But even with that knowledge, it didn't prepare her to see who was at the door. "Hello." All Might beamed. "Is your father home?" She was too stunned to move her mouth after it had fallen open. "Well, he wasn't at the agency and his people said he should be here." All Might, the #1 hero, the man Izuku had looked up to for all her life, stood in the doorway. Though he was without his costume, Izuku would have been a fool to miss him anyway. "So I'm here in person to talk hero to hero," he boomed, flashing a smile. He was really here. For a second she had thought the absent weight in her pocket meant that the figurine had come to life somehow. But she remembered she had given it to Shudo this morning. So maybe this was just some nightmare. "Izuku," and hearing Endeavor call her name broke her from her star-stuck trance. A jolt of fear made her stiffen as she heard him approach. His footsteps were always hard on the wood. Endeavor came to the door and Izuku backed off, watching with wide eyes at the scene in front of her. The flames on his face ignited and flickered with annoyance. "Why are you here?" Endeavor flatly said, but Izuku could tell by the way his fire intensified at the words that he was holding back an ocean of anger. "Hey there, could we talk inside? This is kinda a private conversation." Endeavor folded his arms. "Why didn't you just call? You never pick up." He laughed a little before smiling again. "Fine." Even Endeavor couldn't refuse the #1 hero, but by the way his body stood he just wanted to slam the door in All Might's face. "Let's go to my office," he huffed out. His office wasn't somewhere Izuku was able to go to even clean. Izuku hid back in the kitchen, pretending she had been doing something with the food the whole time. It didn't seem like Endeavor had noticed her eavesdropping and Izuku let out a silent sigh of relief. Thank goodness that Endeavor had the compound shaped to his height, or Izuku doubted that All Might would comfortably be able to come inside without bumping his head. As they passed her, All Might shot her another smile before turning back to Endeavor. "Your daughter is very cute. She must be breaking all the boys' hearts." Endeavor stayed silent as they climbed the stairs. His hand gripped the railing tight. She could almost smell the smoke. Unfazed by his lack of response, All Might continued to try and make small talk. "Do you have any other kids?" And again as their footsteps faded, Endeavor still didn't reply. And All Might tried again to engage him, but this time it was too muffled for Izuku to hear before the door closed behind them. Izuku stood there stunned, not really processing what was going on. She didn't know how long she just stood in the kitchen with her mouth hung open, but soon the slide of Endeavor's office door jolted her. Quickly, to seem like she had been actually doing something instead of just floundering around like some fish, she went back to chopping her carrots. They came down the stairs and All Might finally seemed to have given up on small talk with Endeavor, all silence. Something slipped as she brought the knife down and nicked her finger. She let out a surprised hiss and started to Isuke the wound as metallic blood filled her mouth. "Are you all right, young Todoroki?" And he genuinely looked like he meant it. She needed to say yes, but she wanted to say no. In the end, her words came out a mashed up, muttering mess that could barely be counted as human speech. "Why don't I help you bandage that bad boy up? Can you point to where they are stored?" The All Might was wanting to help her in something as small as a cut. Izuku nodded and pointed to a drawer at the end of the counter. With the man standing in front of her, Izuku had to come to very real thoughts that she had been pushing back more and more, but no longer could. Thanks to her near-obsessive knowledge as a child, Izuku knew that Recovery Girl had been, probably still was, All Might's personal doctor. Coupled with the fact that the world never saw the man's family, it brought a pit to her stomach. All these little connections added up to a perfect storm of "don't meet your heroes." Izuku had learned that the hard way. And maybe she was being selfish by keeping this to herself, to keep that kernel of hope still buried deep that her childhood hero wasn't like him because saying anything out loud made them true, real. So she stayed silent, let All Might think she was Endeavor's daughter. So she let him help her put a bandage on her hand and hoped that somewhere he didn't have a family like Endeavor had. "Well, I'm off," All Might declared, giving both her and Endeavor his signature smile. And as quickly as he had crashed through he had left, leaving a smoking Endeavor. Izuku didn't think she had ever seen him this mad. As he was blinded by his rage, Izuku took this opportunity to leave, citing in her mind if she was asked that she was going to pick the kids up from school, albeit an hour early. With her purse and coat, on soft feet, she was off and Endeavor didn't even seem to notice. Whatever he was going to do next was not something she wanted to be around. She picked up Shudo first, not wanting to run into Mitsuki by accident again. It wasn't that she was avoiding her, you don't avoid Mitsuki Bakugu, but she just wouldn't be able to form a sentence when she asked what was going on, not today. And Izuku seriously doubted that she would be able to any other day either. Though being so early she did have to sign him out. He came into the office with his backpack on and a tilt of his head. "What are you doing here so early?" Definitely not because she was avoiding people. Just 'cause, she shrugged. Seemingly, that was a good enough answer for Shudo, who took her hand with earnestness. "Do you have the picture of All Might I drew?" Izuku nodded. "Sorry, I forgot to give it back this morning, it had slipped my mind," and was about to fish it out of her pocket, but he shook his head. "Give me it tomorrow so I can give it to the teacher," he said as they left the building. "Everyone draws her All Mights." Of course. It truly was an appealing day. The cherry blossoms were in bloom, and the air had lost its angry nip. Swinging their hands back and forth, Shudo asked, "Are we gonna go get everyone else?" "Well, they're still at school but we are gonna wait for them." "That sounds boring," he complained. "It can be fun. Watch." She let go of his hand and came up to the chalk hopscotch in front of the elementary school and on one leg began to hop. As she finished she turned back to Shudo, who tried to mimic her with much less success, mostly due to his backpack swinging wildly as he hopped from square to square. "Take that off, silly." Shudo did so and bounded back to the beginning to try again. Over and over he hopped till he seemed to have had enough. Before she could react, Shudo bolted to the cherry blossom tree across the way, in front of the middle school. By the time Izuku had caught him, he was about to put one of the flowers from the low-hanging branches into his mouth. "Shudo!" "No!" exclaimed Izuku, gathering him up in her arms. No flower was eaten and Izuku let out a sigh. "Don't eat flowers," Izuku explained, shifting the boy to be more comfortable in her grasp. "Okay, I won't. But they look so tasty." "I know, but flowers are for looking at and sniffing, not tasting." Was it normal for little kids like him to try and shove things into their mouths? She'd have to Google that. He nodded in understanding. "Can I sniff them then?" "Yes, but no eating." In her arms, she lifted him toward a branch where he closed his eyes and let the petals tickle his face. He giggled and took a deep breath in. A smile crept onto his face. Peace washed over him, almost going limp in her arms. Izuku couldn't help but smile too. "What are you guys doing?" She asked. Had the bell even rung, and how about the elementary school bell too? Izuku must have missed both. Shudo, without missing a beat, replied, sniffing. But not eating, he looked to Izuku for approval. Yes, we're smelling them but not eating them. She repeated back. The parenting book she had been reading in her spare time had really emphasized the importance of repetition and praise. Good job. Fuyumi joined in with Natsuo in tow, from across the street. Can I smell too? She asked as the crowd around them slowly started to dissipate. In response, Izuku brought down a branch to her level where she would be able to reach. Can you make katsudon for dinner again, pretty please? Natsuo folded his hands and begged with all the drama a kid could muster. It'll have to be another time. Your father isn't in a good mood today. So we're gonna spend some time at the park. She wouldn't tell them about All Might stopping by. There wouldn't be any words in any language to explain how she felt about that encounter. And again, maybe she wanted to be a little selfish and keep this thing to herself. Tuya gave her a quick concerned look but went back to being disinterested. That sounds dumb. Izuku had to suppress the urge to roll her eyes. What else was she supposed to do? Where else would they go? Either way, we're going to the park, whether you like it or not, Izuku said as she put down a squirmy Shudo who was vibrating with excitement. Come on Tuya, it'll be fun. Natsuo came up behind him and gave him a good slap on the back. You're it? It took him a moment to realize what was going on. Natsuo was already halfway to the playground before Tuya started to run after him, Fuyumi and Shudo right behind them. Izuku watched them run as she took a seat on one of the benches, smiling despite what had happened today. She let the wind go through her hair and took a deep breath. The hours went by and their games shifted from tag to racing to soccer, just to repeat themselves over again. Other kids joined in from time to time but slowly they left and the Todorokis were the only ones that remained in the whole park. Alone with the streetlights. As she called out to them, she couldn't help but feel a pit form in her stomach. Taking them home would be a mistake. And now that had been the plan since they probably shouldn't be here this late. They came with smiles on their faces and out of breath, Shudo trailing behind last but did eventually catch up. I'm tired, Shudo whined as he grabbed and hung off Izuku's hand, going dead limp in a dramatic fashion. I know, but we've got to get groceries. They technically didn't, but it was another excuse to be out of the house for longer. Izuku hoped that Endeavor had just worked himself up and then went to sleep, like some angry toddler. But alas, that was only wishful thinking. At that, Shudo slumped onto the sidewalk with a long whine. Sighing, Izuku picked him up and put him on her hip for the next couple blocks till they got to the store. Izuku grabbed a cart with one hand, she had been getting good at doing that kind of thing now, and placed Shudo in the child's seat in front. He was almost too big but he didn't seem to mind, as he quietly essayed on his thumb and looked at everything with mild interest. Why does Shudo get to go in the cart? Natsuo complained and crossed his arms with a pout. I want to turn. Because he's 4 and you're too big, Izuku explained, pushing the cart down an aisle. If you want I can carry you. Fuyumi offered. Offended, Natsuo responded. Not if I carry you first. And he heaved her up as she squeaked in surprise. No. I'll carry you first. Fuyumi squirmed out of his grip to only try lifting him up to not much success. Inside voices and no roughhousing in the store, please. Izuku tried to put some emphasis on her words but her tiredness was getting the best of her at that moment. Then she had to add no running, which Fuyumi and Natsuo did listen to, but instead took to speed walking to get each other as they circled the pallets of rice. Surprisingly, Tuya didn't join in and just stayed by the cart as it rolled. Izuku gave him a concerned glance, which he pointedly looked away from. Hey, you okay? She reached a hand but he flinched away and she retracted it. Only the hum of the generic music, Natsuo's and Fuyumi's giggles, and people's carts filled the noise between them. Izuku could feel herself stop breathing. She tried again. You can tell me. This time, his shoulders relaxed a tinge and he made eye contact with her. Just don't laugh. I want to join the play. Of course you should, you do great. I'll sign the papers or whatever you need. Izuku smiled. This would be good for him, get out there, make friends, get out of trouble. He gave her an incredulous look. You will. All you guys got the drama in you. It must be genetic, she said in hopes to make him laugh and Tuya let out a good-natured huff. Yeah well, your new baby is gonna be just as dramatic, he said so nonchalantly with no malice. Tuya hadn't even seemed to notice how she froze at those Words. As you said, it's genetic? Grabbing a packet of crackers, he put it in the cart. She let out a shuddering breath. In her heart, she knew that any child she had would be dead, and in good conscience, she could never bring a child in her life. But it didn't seem like it would be any of her choice. Her heart just hurt thinking about it. There was barely enough of her to take care of the kids already in her life. Izuku caught a glimpse of her transparent reflection in the grocery store window. Of course, it was her, but things had changed. She hadn't noticed the curve of her nose stuck out now, not set right after the break, or how deep her eye bags sat on her face. Her hand raised to touch her face, to make sure it was the same person. The freckles were the same, though more harshly contrasted against her now paler skin. It was as if everything she looked like shifted slightly to the left. Izuku? Tia asked as he stared into the window reflection as well, watching her movements like a hawk. Startled, Izuku immediately turned away from the window to see all of them staring at her with a mix of confusion and concern. Before any of them could comment, Izuku started to push the cart again. It's nothing, guys, we're almost done. We just got one more aisle, only a little time left before we have to go back. They checked out and placed all the groceries into their bags. Tuya had made a point to carry more, which Natsuo and Fuyumi noticed and tried to challenge his place as the best carrier. Even Shudo tried, but he could barely carry one, and it got too heavy for him where Izuku had to carry his back. At the driveway, her heart beat out of her chest. The unknown mess she would be walking into was about to throw her into a panic. With deep breaths, she walked up to the door and stepped inside. The charge was led by her. She had to stay strong. The children followed, acutely aware of what a bad mood meant. Their bickering about who could hold the most stopped at the door. A tornado must have come through was the only way she could describe the destruction. The table was half burnt to a crisp, plates were broken, doors were off. And at the center of it all was Endeavor, standing in the mess he had made. He faced away from them, his back heaving with every breath. Smoke filled the air thick. Every single one of them froze. All eyes were on him, surrounded by the byproduct of his anger. Endeavor kept his back to them as he stated, no room for argument. Shudo is starting training again. Pull him out of school and I'll arrange the tutors. The grocery bag in her hand fell to the floor. Izuku's stomach plummeted to her feet. The urge to yell and scream, coursed through her at breakneck speeds, but she held her tongue till she tasted blood. She couldn't aggravate him now, not when he had already destroyed half the house and the kids were right next to her. They couldn't be hurt due to her mistakes, not again. He walked over the debris and up the stairs, muttering to himself about having to use the extra till he was out of sight. The slam of his bedroom door was the signal for all of them to melt from their stiffened trance. Izuku, don't make me train, please. Shudo let out a choked sob. Izuku turned to see him begin to cry big, fat tears. Joining him, her tears stung all the way down, reminding her how weak she really was. Between hiccuping gasps, he whispered as if telling a secret. Please, I don't wanna. His little hands came out and wrung themselves in her shirt, desperate for a safety she couldn't bring him. She sank to her knees and didn't wince as the shards of broken dishware cut them deep, already soaking her breaths red. All her attention was on the child in front of, begging her to protect him. With shaky hands, she cupped his cheeks reverently, not wiping the tears. Please. All Izuku could do was bring him in close and not let go, her sobs mixing with his.